Welcome everybody to another episode of the Imperial 80s. Mtume, it's good to be with you.
Good to be with you too, Jay. Hope everybody's doing well out there as well as they can in these moments.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I was watching this morning a lot of video of prisoners being reunited with their families, like in Gaza, and then families hearing that their family member has been released but is being exiled, and all this kind of stuff. And obviously we didn't plan, we have these on Monday, usually sometimes on Friday,
Hmm.
but we didn't plan to coincide with such a heavy day. And so I
Yeah.
totally understand if people are watching something else today and want to come back and watch this later. It will be here. And shout out to everybody who's here with us live this morning. This should be a fun conversation.
Hmm.
um and yeah, somebody said they're watching Poltergeist now, so they'll watch later. Yeah, we will be heavy into the spoilers today. So if you have not seen
Totally.
it before, then yeah, definitely, and you want to watch it, which
Yeah.
I don't I don't know that I would recommend, but like, you know, it's a movie. So
Yeah.
if you want to watch it and come back, then feel free to do that. But yeah, it'll be fun. So yeah, where do you want to start? We want to start with
I mean,
our memories of first seeing it.
we could start with the memories and then the rewatch.
Yeah,
Because I
yeah,
do feel like Poltergeist is one of those movies of the 80s that's like a staple. It's a cultural staple of the 80s. If I think of like a dozen or so like movies or just ideas around movies, from Indiana Jones to Star Wars and so forth and so on. Poltergeist for me still has that kind of purchase and like my memory as like a cult thing, they're here and all these type of stuff. But to be perfectly honest with you, I hadn't watched the movie in a really long time, in a massively long time. And my experience watching this time was like, oh man, I had so many feelings that were not in the positive. But we'll get to that. A lot of it actually has to do around the filmmaking. To be perfectly honest with you, like the thematic stuff. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to talk about. I think in that level, and like the kind of the zeitgeist of that early '80s, early Reagan period. But we can talk about that. But yeah, I remember it's interesting. I can't remember the first time I saw the movie, actually. Um, but I always remember the image of little like the Carol Ann girl and the TV being a really big thing. And I will say, when I was a little kid, it scared me. I was very scared by I think more by the idea of Poltergeist. The other thing is, on cable, Poltergeist 2 used to come on a lot. The first one didn't, whatever cable I was watching. And I was always scared by a person that I would actually later come to revere as a theater artist, by Julian Beck of the Living Theater, who is the embodiment of what would later become, I guess, the Beast. He's like one of the embodiments of the Beast, but they don't really use that storyline until like part 2. But in part 1, so it in the 80s, like Poltergeist had this kind of like fear thing for me. I think, but I think it's because I couldn't really remember the movie. I had made up in my head these concepts that it was like this really scary thing. And I feel like the last time I saw it was probably in my late teens, early 20s, maybe in college or something. I watched it. And I don't know, I was probably smoking lots of joints or something, hanging out with the homies. And like it, not that I thought it was scary, but I still had this kind of perception that it was like this thing. So when I watched it on Saturday, I had like, well, first of all, I was like, I'm not scared whatsoever. There was nothing scary about it at all for me. The themes, which we'll talk about, I think at a pretty large level, were very curious for me, but they invoked a lot of things that I think are very familiar, and even some new things I think we'll probably bring up that we haven't quite brought up before. The filmmaking I found really annoying, but I do think that's another conversation that we'll get into about the kind of, in many ways, this like puts the end to New Hollywood. And it's funny, Jay and I had a offline conversation about, the kind of end of New Hollywood, and people talked about what that is. The 70s movie, some people call it, was to start in the late 60s. But yeah, so watching it this time, and like the final thing I said is like, watching this movie, it brought out all my atheism. Like my atheism just like it like poured out of my body. Like I just had to like this reaction that like I don't have happen with all movies that I watch. Like I don't like we're gonna do Prince of Darkness next week. And that's a movie very much about theology, though it has a great twist on theology. I don't want to go into that, but that doesn't like, like feed into that for me. Like, but this one, like my atheism was just like, hey, guess what? You don't believe in none of this shit. I couldn't. I had this like hard time adjusting, and it was. But yeah, I'll leave it at that. I'll throw it to Jay.
That's funny. I look. It'll be interesting to talk with you as we get into it about like what triggers your atheism in that way within this movie. I mean, yeah. So anyway, for me, I guess I would say is, I mean, definitely, I know we'll talk about this more, but to me, this feels very much a Steven Spielberg movie. And I know that he obviously has his fingerprints all over it. But, when you're watching it, you're like, yeah, this is like right between Close Encounters of the Third Kind and E.T., and it's right in the lane of those movies, with a little bit more of a an attempt to cross over into, I guess, horror. Although I agree with you. I mean, there are aspects of it you watch as a kid, I think, that are scary, like, but as an adult, it doesn't have that factor to you. Like, most horror films are designed to be scary to adults as well, and or they're supposed to be, I would say. And this film is very much not, I don't think. Although there are some interesting things. I mean, it does tap into a thing around kids being kind of creepy that, like, I think is also an 80s, kind of theme. But yeah, my first watches, I don't really remember. I think I probably saw part of it actually with my father. I'm not positive about that. But I remember talking to him about the idea of poltergeists. Obviously, I remember scenes from it. I remember watching it more thoroughly, in my teenage years. And I remember, kind of in that, I think the same era that I was kind of interested in rewatching some Spielberg stuff, which I have to say, I mean, we've talked about this before, but I'm not a Spielberg fan. I mean, there's a couple of movies. I like Jaws. I like, there's the first movie that he did that was like a TV movie. I'm trying to remember the name of it, but it's a truck that's like chasing a
Duel,
guy over. Duel.
duel.
Yeah. I loved that movie as a kid. I saw that when I was young. I know it's a 70s movie, but I saw it in the 80s with my dad, and we both got a kick out of that movie. But it's very weird and silly too, but it's entertaining. um, but yeah, so I don't have a lot of. I do remember it's almost like an early meme, movie. Like it has the same like kind of Goonies like vibes and stuff, where you get the these little moments, and maybe we'll do some, share of some of those clips for Patreon or whatever, but like there's characters in it, and children in it, and you said the "they're here" thing. There's all these little moments that also were very much, I very much remember in the 80s. Like, whether I even could place them culturally as being poltergeists, I don't know that I could at that age, but like it just was stuff that just my friends would do and we would do, and so it has a lot of those moments where if it was a movie now, and some of it still lives on social media, but if it were to come out now, this would be like GIFs or GIFs and like, a bunch of memes, So it's interesting in that way, the kind of, I guess, mimetic, quality of the film. Um, but yeah, I mean, I guess my first impressions are that for me, other than being aware of certain cultural resonances around it, um, I never had a strong attachment to this film, and rewatching it now, I can kind of see why. And I should say I never liked Spielberg movies that much. Like I was not an ET fan. And ET is like a huge, huge 80s movie for a lot of people. And I just thought it was very boring. I thought it was like one of the most boring movies that I had ever seen when I watched it. Um, this movie's not quite as boring. Like I think there are parts of it that are kind of entertaining. It moves. And that's the thing too. You talked about this when we talked about Raiders, is the way that Spielberg just uses like action kind of to move the film, or movement. Like I'm also thinking a lot about movement. Samantha Youssef, in a recent conversation was talking about how, I think she was talking about Fantastic Four, and how, nothing much has to happen. If things are moving on screen, like then people will just watch it and kind of tune in, and that's the way I feel about a big part of this movie, is that there's some interesting moments in terms of the plot and in scenes, and some interesting, I think, metaphorical qualities to it that we will talk about a little bit, and questions about it, also about how people read it. And I think there's critiques within it, but like you know there's like places we can take the critiques, but there's also clearly a limit, I think, in what was intended in terms of the critiques by the creators of the film. um and so yeah, I don't have much more to say to open up, but that those are kind of first impressions.
Word. So I do think this is a good time to jump into the creators of the film, which is like a really interesting story in itself. There's also other cult things around the film that maybe we could talk about at some point, though I don't want to dive too much into it, as much as I want to mention it, because I think it is part of 80s. Well, I don't think you could just like put it into just the 80s, but it's definitely a figure of like the 80s psychology of like myth and the myths that come out and the kind of attachment, which I also think make this film keep playing. But in a way, there is a perversion to that, I think, when you think about that. Some of this actually has to do with like people dying, and some of them dying in like really like terrible ways. um so the film is directed by Tobe Hooper, which is like one of the big I don't want to say controversies. Maybe it is for some. It's a big like thing of legend. A little bit about Hopper. Hopper is a
Hooper.
film.
It's
Hooper.
it's
Hooper is Hooper.
Hooper.
Oh,
Yeah.
Hooper. Hooper is a director who pretty much got his big part of his fame from Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original. Though he did do the second one as well, but the original is like really where his fame kind of hits. And really, these movies could be no different. Like they're like absolutely like they totally are very different pieces. And Hooper, like, his career is interesting. Like when you try to read about like his like early days, he was like a professor. He did a lot of like documenting camera work, and he does like a short which helped him. I think he like entered it in, but he couldn't get it in time. And he just seemed like kind of a guy like making stuff, right? And he makes but he's part of that era of like, because what in the 70s you definitely have like the new Hollywood stuff, but that it was studio funded. You have your Scorsese's, you have your Spielbergs who come out of that era too, Coppola. But these are people who are working within the studio. Yes, they're doing a new kind of style, but then you have like a subset of like people who are really independent, right? You had Cassavetes, you had Wes Craven, even, who we talked about when he did Last House on the Left, which I think was 72 or 74, right? No, it's 72 because it was before Texas Chainsaw Massacre, right? So these like micro budget movies, and they do Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and it's this massive hit. And I to this day still think it's a fantastic piece. I think it's incredible. But it's success, takes Hooper to various levels, and he's able to do like miniseries. He does like the Salem's Lot miniseries, and some other stuff. The Funhouse, I think, is another big one that he does like right before this. This is an interesting film because it was a Spielberg script with two other people whose names I don't have in front of me. Maybe Jay, maybe you have it.
I can pull it up. Yeah, he did Spielberg does the story, and then the question always is like, how much was he actually involved in the script? But
and even and then also the shoot. So the assumption that's always been kind of made, because one of the things about it is like everybody says something different about the movie. It's like you can't really get a consistent story. And is that because Spielberg was doing E.T., this is true, he was contractually obligated to only do E.T. He could not direct another film, but he could produce, he could do much other functions, but directing he could not do. So this film, which was developed with these two other writers, it was going through different things within Hollywood. Frank Marshall is like the really big name to kind of like lead produce it. This is an earlier film for Marshall, but if you look at Frank Marshall's Wikipedia, you got Hollywood everywhere, all types of movies, Hook, all types of big famous tentpole flicks, that we've all seen if we were around in that era. Right.
He was also connected to Raiders of the Lost Ark too. So like the collaboration with Spielberg goes,
it goes big right there. So this actually might germinate it, because Raiders is 2 years later, right? Is that what it is? Or something like that?
So Raiders is the year before.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is right between Raiders and E.T. And because he's already directing E.T.
Yeah.
The studio has an obligation that says he can't direct two films at once for Spielberg.
So with that being said, the assumption is that Hooper would have directed the film, right? But when you get to the kind of tail of the tape, everything from, and I don't honestly want to go through everybody, from actors to different people who worked on the set. You'll have actors who say, "No, Spielberg directed everything," right? Actually, I think the woman who plays, what's her name? The woman who plays the great ghost whisperer at the end of the film. She pretty much said
she's amazing.
Yeah, she's like the best thing in the movie.
Tangina.
Tangina, right? She's the one, and in her, she said Spielberg directed all of her scenes. But then someone said she's lying. It's like a constant kind of back and forth. I mean, some people say things like Spielberg, that Hooper would say, action and cut, but all the kind of prep for like the set, really approving what happened with costume, production design, makeup, even actor performance choices would go through Spielberg. So, which is very much sounds like directing to me. Go ahead.
I would just say I watched like a making of that was like done contemporaneously, like it was like a DVD extra at some point or something like that. And like what you see in it is Spielberg is always on set, like always like talking to people. And normally a guy who's like just a writer or the story, I don't imagine would be like that intimately involved on scene, on set with stuff like that. So whether he technically directs it or not, like clearly his level of involvement is much higher than it would typically be for like a screenwriter.
Yeah, and producers do that. I mean, producers do that. There are, tales of producers who are that hands-on and that, menacing to their directors and people and telling them what to do. But the other evidence for me, and I think Jay alludes to it, the biggest evidence to me that Hooper probably didn't like direct a lot of it is the movie. Like when I'm watching the movie, it's totally Spielbergian. Like I'm watching it and I'm like, because I remember when I was many years ago, I think I was at a bar or something, and we were doing like, you know, one of those like conversations about who directed what or who made the best movie, and and like Spielberg comes up, and someone was like, Poltergeist, man. That's like one of people underestimate how great Poltergeist is. I was like, he didn't direct that movie, and they were like, what are you talking about? Yes, he did, right? And it's like, and then because it's like stuck in your brain because it looks so Spielberg, you're watching it and you're getting it, like, and when we get into the movie, we'll talk about it. Like, it just has all of his tricks. You can't help but just be whisked into that thinking, right? And also for me seeing Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I'm like, this doesn't feel like a thing that Hooper would make. Like, I don't get it as a is a signature to his directing style. Even later, when you watch Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2, even something as terrible as Life Force, which we should actually do. Life Force is a weird ass movie that he directed. But even his controversy on that one too, I've actually read. So yeah, so there's a lot of stuff with that when it comes to like the making of it. And but you do have to go through Spielberg to kind of get into the kind of like ideologies of the movie too, because he talks a lot about, you know, like even like the suggestions of what you would see on the TV other than like the blurry mist when what they were watching all comes from Spielberg's childhood. A lot of these things, the points of nostalgia are things that he was interested in. Though Hooper did say the ghost story thing was something that he was really interested. He actually pushed the script more towards that direction from like a previous kind of iteration that wanted to focus on something else. Go ahead.
I mean, and that makes some sense to me because I think like everything about the film kind of feels like you said like a Spielberg movie other than I mean, Spielberg does do like suspense, like I mean, people could debate whether you think Jaws is a horror movie or even something like The Duel is a horror movie. Like there he does like that kind of, dramatic thing between something coming to get you or like, some kind of evil force, and the hero or whatever in a film. But I don't, I don't at all think of Spielberg as a horror director, and I think that um obviously this film I don't fully put in a kind of horror genre. Like it's interesting, like Wikipedia uses this term supernatural horror, which like, it's more on the supernatural side to me than it is really horror, but the especially because nobody gets killed, right? Like this is part of it too, right? Does anybody die in this movie at all? I don't think so. Um and
I mean, there's dead people. That's like
well,
the
yes,
thing. And
yes,
but
yes.
but I'm saying, but no, to your point, they're past tense and they come
Yeah.
back. But no, I don't think anyone actually dies. No, you're right.
Yeah. Yeah, which is to me, it's like a quintessential. Like I don't know that it can be a real horror movie if nobody like gets killed on screen in the movie. Like I don't think that I really count that. But the but having said that, yeah, I mean, obviously the kind of the undead quality, the poltergeists, the ghosts that are part of it, there is a lot of it where it's kind of, spiritual, and the other important thing that we should throw in here is industrial light and sound, right? Again, like, Lucas is involved here, maybe not named, directly, but it's his company that does the effects in this movie as well. So it's, again, a kind of continuation of Raiders, and there's actually, like, even some of the music reminded me a little bit of Raiders of the Lost Ark at time when you get that Rebirth song and all of this, it's like it actually kind of it's very interesting that way. But um the the scene where all the bodies come back, that felt more like a Hooper moment than a Spielberg moment. Like I didn't really see Spielberg putting something like that in. So that makes sense to me that those would be kind of the ways that Hooper might say, okay, guys, we have to make this a little bit scary or
Come on, throw the horror people a bone, please. Like, I know you want to do E.T. meets The Exorcist, but like, come on, bro. Like, you gotta give the horror people something here.
That's a perfect description of it. It's like E.T. or Close Encounters meets The Exorcist. It's like a very yeah.
Yeah, and I have to say, there's a couple things, and like, man, this is sometimes when I wish I had influence, because there's a great Twilight Zone episode called Little Girl Lost. People might have seen this one. It's about when the parents wake up and the girl is in the wall. She goes into a dimension in the wall, and the dad has to go in and get her. And she's like, "Daddy, Daddy." I was like, "Oh, this is Little Girl Lost." I was like, they totally grabbed this from Rod Serling in the end of Peoples. Like, it's totally Little Girl Lost with, like, definitely making it into a nearly 2-hour movie, right? And adding, and I think another one to bring in, because I definitely think Exorcist lives with this. I think that you're still seeing the kind of like residue of The Exorcist, but we're in a new level in the 80s where we have like new anxieties. The God is dead thing is not really an anxiety as much as suburban things and suburban guilt or settler guilt. I think we'll definitely talk about a lot about that. Because the other one I think is a movie like Amityville Horror, and this idea that your house is haunted, which I think goes directly to like the suburban anxiety of white people. And whether it's not always supernatural, some of it is material, right? You're about to invest in all these homes, the big suburban boom, the coming like suburban anxiety of like people snatching your kids and stuff like that. All this stuff just gets wrapped up in it. And I thinking about Spielberg, he definitely is a person who has a very like weird, he wants to acknowledge that like urban planning, like he does it in Jaws, that like urban planning and urban whatchamacallit, like the leadership or capital, we would call them capitalists, he would call them business people, are unethical, they do dodgy things, right, so forth and so on, like like in Jaws with the, I guess it's the mayor, right, him letting the people go back to the beach full well knowing that the shark probably hasn't been dealt with, but he wants to let them go back to the beach. And he says, like, literally, he's like, come on, we like, the economy is going to crash here, we have to let them back in, right? So he's into that kind of like corporate malfeasance thing, which he definitely puts full front. Him and Hooper put full front in this movie. But like Jay alluded to, there is a limit to that critique and how far they actually really want to go. And then also what they manifest as the villain, I just think is like the kind of like, because while that guy, this corporate guy is the villain, he's the secondary villain, or maybe the overarching, but he's not the villain that we're like wrestling with watching the film, right? We're wrestling with these like undead people. One last thing, and I think we want to bring it in. So one of the kind of things that with the film that I think has helped carry it is some of the tragedies around it, that existed to the point where, like, the 80s loved to do the kind of mythologies of like films being haunted. You see it with the 3 men and a baby thing with like the shot and this type of stuff, and it's just a bad edit, everyone. Like, anyone who believes that, it's just they didn't edit something right, and you see someone in the corner, like nothing's actually happening there. Right, like that didn't happen. I mean, the film had a tragedy with one of the actresses who played the oldest daughter, I think Dominique Dune, right? She was murdered by her boyfriend, really tragically, really horribly, right? And I think it happens like right after the film, I think, or like I think the film had just came out or something like that. It had been out for a little bit. It was right around that time. And then you have that. You of course have like the kind of young death of like the famous actress in it and things like the young actress, right? And a lot of other stuff. So it got to this like legend. The film is like haunted, and there's like a whole cult around the film being haunted, which kind of adds to the movie. And to me, where there's a perversion to it, because I think it's part of the film's zeitgeist that I think that really exists in the 80s. These kinds of like supernatural answers to everything. And it just makes me kind of go back to that era that we grew up in, Jay, and like makes me go like, no one could cope with any of the real shit. Any real analysis of the world was like gone, right? Like no one wanted to listen to anyone who really knew what the real was up, and they just their answer was ghosts or you know, haunted, right? Or even the thing which actually ended up being true, that there's real skeletons actually used in the film, which actually ends up being true. Yes, right. It was a rumor for years, and we'll get to that when we get to that part. Yeah, it is real skeletons used in the film for a part, which I think is terrible. But that became part of the legend, where it was like,
well, no wonder they were haunted. I mean, come on, like
exactly.
this is,
But I'm saying it becomes part of the legend. Everyone's like, this film is haunted, and da-da-da-da-da. So I guess it's like pre-viral. Like I don't know how to like. I struggle with the whole idea of virality before the internet, but I guess it's like the pre-viral thing. But I also think you have to think about how people have kind of like capitalized it in like the new Easter egg market, right? Manufacturing your own legend and things like that, because they saw what it did for movies like Poltergeist and so forth and so on. Any other things in like the building of the film or like pre the actual movie you want to bring in here, Jay?
I mean, I can talk a little bit about some stuff from just the making of it, I guess. So like Frank Marshall. So I meant to put this in the thing, but I will. There's like a 8-minute video I referenced that was like a making of, which is like really bare bones and obviously is just kind of a promotional product. It may have actually been something that came out um like on TV or something like that to promote it at that time. But Frank Marshall says they didn't want the scary mansion, and so that's one of the things about this film is it is very much a suburban film, obviously, right? And I think that's an interesting thing because a lot of horror movies, obviously, we do have like kind of the haunted house, right? Which is like some creepy, people move into a house out in the middle of nowhere and it's like this really nice house. And like, how did we afford this thing? And then it's like, turns out that it's haunted, right? Or, the old castle, the old mansion, these spaces that are kind of removed from where most people live. And what's funny about how they describe this, though, is that they describe it as this is Frank Marshall, quote, "We wanted our setting to be very normal, and Steven then set the story in a very normal, everyday situation," end quote. Marshall talks about how this was the type of neighborhood he grew up in Phoenix, Arizona. Craig Nelson also talks about who's the actor who plays the father in the story. Talks about them as a very normal family that does very normal things, and I think that I mean, that's so funny because it's like all coded as like white suburban, right? Like that what is normal is white people in the suburbs. And I think that it's so 80s, first of all, like that this idea of this, ethnically homogenous white suburban enclave that might have one or two people of color in it. But in this case, I don't think so. I can't remember any maybe is there a non-white character?
One
Oh, well, yes.
one of the workers.
Right. Yeah. Right. One of the people who comes with the parapsychologists group, who actually is Beyonce's stepdad, by the way.
Yeah,
But
Richard Lawson, and but also one of the Sonny Latham from Predator. He's one of the construction people.
right, right. Yeah. So there's a couple people, but it is, largely. It's not. First of all, it's not implied that they necessarily live there, right? They could be coming from somewhere else to work there, and especially the blanking is Richard Lawson's character. They go to UC Irvine to find them, and they come there. But it's set in Simi Valley, which the name of the place, they come up with a fictional name, Cuesta Verde, um, which is like just bad white Spanish. But which the town that it's actually filmed in, it's northwest of LA. It's actually where the Rodney King trial takes place for the officers who end up getting acquitted. It took place there. So that tells you a little bit something about the actual kind of racial politics of the area we're talking about. The Reagan Presidential Library is there, and Reagan had a home there for like a vacation home there for like 20 years at the end of his life. It's just interesting because in the film, um, Craig T. Nelson's actually reading a book about Reagan in one of the first scenes. And I was curious about that because he didn't, as far as I know, Reagan didn't have a relationship with this area yet in 1982, other than obviously he was governor of California before he became president, right? And he was president at the time of the film. Um, but I thought that was kind of interesting that it ends up being where the Reagan Library now is. Um, so there's that, but I think the more interesting aspect of it is that they really wanted to present this as normal, right? And that and to make, and I mean there's a lot of things in the early scenes about the family and the stuff that they're doing and like how they're relating to one another and all of that, but that are trying to hammer home this idea of like this is just like where you live or whatever. But obviously we're talking about a subset, a distinct subset of American society. It is not a film that really speaks at all to people in the cities, at least in terms of like what their experiences are. And it's also not a like rural story either. So it's interesting in that respect, the way that all the people involved kind of think about it and talk about it as this very like this is normal. This is how Americans actually live. And I think we see more of that. I think obviously like Nightmares on Elm Street is another version of that kind of move, I guess, with the 80s horror films, but different in a lot of ways. More people die. And then you have another film that I think is interestingly connected to this film, which takes it to an urban setting, is actually Ghostbusters. Like, I do think that this film, in certain ways, has a lot of the early kind of kernels of things that you see more developed in a film like Ghostbusters, which we will, of course, have to eventually do. But even on the level of effects, the level of casting, some of the choices around like how the characters are going to engage. And I think that's part of also why I struggle a little bit to call it horror, is because this is very much intended to be a blockbuster. Like, it's intended to be a mainstream media product in the same way that something like Ghostbusters, I think, is even more successful at, right? Because Ghostbusters gets to the point where we can have cartoons about this, we can have action figures about this. But it is that kind of transition where it's like we can take elements of the horror genre and move them into mainstream blockbusters that even kids can watch. And I think this is like somewhere in that transition phase that before you get to something like Ghostbusters.
I mean, you bring up a good point, and I think we alluded to it in the Nightmare episode, but I think if the 70s or New Hollywood was very obsessed with the cities and the rural, because that's really kind of like the big um locus. You honestly, I would say the 80s has a bigger obsession with the suburbs. I mean, you go to John Hughes, right? I mean, most of the teen films are the suburbs, right? In the 80s, right? All of that type of stuff. Or and if it is in the city, you're talking about like kind of places like right outside of the main area. So like it'd be like Glendale in LA, right? Or Pasadena, they would be in places like that, not necessarily like in the heart of like LA proper, unless you're having a film where it's like Beverly Hills Cop, that the guy from the city, but actually he's going to Beverly Hills, so he's going to a niche area. It is the city, but he's going to a niche area. But there is this suburban obsession, and I think this idea that this is how real people, or the real Americans, or the good Americans, or the Americans that we should empathize with, live and dwell. Because this film, that's the thing that kind of, I think, hit me the hardest about Poltergeist watching it, was this need to make me like truly empathize with the white suburban nuclear family. Even more than like empathize with people who like got their graves bulldozed. Like, you know what I'm saying? I was like, wait a minute, but the people I should feel bad for is Craig T. Nelson and Joe Beth. I was like, okay, I mean, that shit sucks. I'm sorry, bro. Like, that's really whack. But yo, what happened with those graves? They did what? You know, and like that's where the movie really begins to kind of start pissing me off in that kind of way.
Yeah. So this is a funny thing. So we'll get to this later, and I'll go back to it. But you know, there's all these ways, I think, where we can sort of radically read what's going on in this film, right? But one of the things that I found really interesting is when you look online about like what people understand this film to be about, they go to they actually go to things that are, I think, much more abstract than I think even the concrete narrative of the film, right? Like, you literally built the suburbs on top of a cemetery, right? And like, you know, like that is the locus of the ghosts and the horror, right? And everything else. And obviously, I mean, people are saying it in the chat, and it's so, you know, settler colonialism is like a perfect, you know, discussion that we can have, right? Capitalism as this like grave digging, unethical system. Like, there's so much that we could dig into there. And what people say things are like, this movie is about the terrors of home ownership and being afraid that your house is going to fall apart on you, or about, you know, the distance between, you know, parents and their children in suburban life. And it's just like, it's so funny because it's like, actually, probably like that's more what was in like Spielberg's mind, is like those kind of abstract things to some extent. But it's so funny because it's like, no, like the shit is right there. Like, you're talking about a suburb that's built upon like excavated graveyard. Like, you know, there's so many interesting things that we could do with this narrative. But you know, they don't do anything in the film to really hammer that home for folks, right? Like, they don't, you know. So I mean, you know, and it doesn't have to be that heavy-handed, but there's just not really great connections to that, and we'll talk about that more as we talk about some of the specific scenes. But it just was so funny to me to read all of these like normie film critic, like, you know, kind of accounts, and just see people like, you know, this is about the nightmares of home ownership and all the things that can go wrong when you own a house. It's like, dude,
I mean,
what?
and there's to your point, like you said, like I probably that's what was in Spielberg's brain to a degree. Like he's tapping into that suburban anxiety, right? But then like you said, it just shows that they're all just like navel gazing. It's like, really, dude, like that's what you take away from, because like the minute, because I remembered that part of the film. But I actually will say, I think even as a kid, for me, and this could just go back to my blackness, or just like my own history, when the whole like burial ground part for me was always like, oh, I'm like, fuck the family, like, oh, like they build it over people's stuff, like that to me has never sat well. Like, I just never, like, and I'm always thinking about the people under the ground, like that's always been my thing. I mean, probably because New York, the African burial grounds here, like all those stories that I've learned since I was a kid about that type of stuff. What happened to indigenous folks here and abroad? Like, it's always been in my hair. But I'm like, you worried about home ownership and the
Yeah.
anxiety over money, and like, but that's also the Reagan thing. I think that's a Reagan era. One thing I will say, I'll throw this in there. an old lefty friend of mine who's white with some really good politics. I remember they told me, they said when Reagan got elected, they couldn't talk to liberals anymore. They said they had like a huge thing. And it's funny, it's very much like when Trump got elected the first time, and probably this time too. But we had this conversation in Trump 1.0, and they were saying that, you know, when Reagan got elected, a lot of the conversations were about like tanking economies and things like this and that. And you know, this old white lefty friend of mine was like, I want to talk about imperialism and it's what he's doing and you know, and they're like, what? Go, like go back to the Vietnam marches, dude. Those are over, right? And like that's kind of like when I'm watching this movie, I realize like it's that kind of brain that exists. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, so let's get into the movie. We can go through some of the scenes and some of the themes, and we'll draw out some of the stuff in more detail. Um, you know, it opens with the national anthem, right? Which again we saw also last week in Nightmare on Elm Street, right? And just to remind people of this, if you weren't alive back then, programming used to end on TV shows, on TV channels, right? So the invention of 24-hour programming on TV channels didn't start to phase in until the 80s, and you know, really the late 80s, early 90s, before you get to a period where like every channel has moved to this place where there's infomercials on, there's reruns on, there's all of this. So it used to be at like midnight that they played the national anthem. They showed the image of the statue of lifting the flag over Iwo Jima, right? Which is what they show in this. And then the TV went to static, or also like this other screen I remember, right, with like different colored bars, right? That would be like sort of, you know, and it would have, and there was these noises, right? Static obviously just had a staticky sound, but there was like kind of a, I don't want to try to replicate it because it'll hurt people's ears, but you know, annoying sounds that would come on, and it was sort of like the reminder to people, like if you fell asleep, like turn your TV off, you know, dummy. And I have to say, nostalgically, I totally miss that. Like, I wish there was something nice about the fact that, like, if you're still awake right now, we're not going to continue to show you things. Like, we're gonna shut this off. And obviously, it wasn't for any great moral or ethical reason. It was a budgetary thing. So, you know, at the time, they hadn't really figured out like, oh, we can really monetize programming after midnight. Not enough people were watching. It didn't make sense for them to continue to do, pay people basically to program stuff and do this. And so they didn't do it. And then eventually they figured out, oh, we can still make money with this time. There's people who work during the day who watch TV at night. There's all kind, you know, so they did this, right? We could sell things to grandma. So, you know, all of that happened, but this was a period. So you get that in the beginning, and the screen goes to fuzz. Um, you know, the dog goes around and finds potato chips from the teenage daughter. Again, I mean, a lot of this, you get the early shots of the suburbs. You get the scene where, you know, in the beginning, Carol Ann, who's the little blonde girl, she goes downstairs, walks up to the TV and starts talking to it, right? She says, "Hello, what do you look like? Talk louder, I can't hear you. Hello, hello, I can't hear you," right? And wakes her family up, who comes down around her, and they think that she's sleepwalking, right? Like that's the thing there. Um, and you know, she starts answering the TV, which is kind of funny, right? She says, "I'm 5." She says 5, right? And then she's like, "Yes, yes, I don't know, I don't know," right? So she's just answering questions, but you don't actually hear the question or anything like that. And she puts her hands on the TV, which is one of the images that you get that's like kind of iconic with the image. And you know, from there you get the next day, you get you know, this big sprawling suburban style community, tons of houses that look almost identical. Like maybe they're arranged slightly different, but the construction is very, you know, typical, like kind of 2-car garage, suburban houses, upper middle class neighborhood. Um, and you get the man on the bike with a pallet of beer, the kids sending remote controlled cars after them, kids at the ice cream truck, the remote control cars trip the guy with the beer. It spills everywhere. And I do have to say this was a weird scene to me because I'm like, he would be so pissed at those kids, and instead he just like picks up some cans that are like hissing beer because it's spurting everywhere, and just runs in the house because football, right? Which maybe that's the real answer, is that he has to get to football and the people watching football so bad that he doesn't care that kids just destroyed like 24 cans of beer with their remote control cars. But then you get the scene, which is an early scene, which I kind of also enjoyed, of they're watching football. Is his name Steve? Yeah, Steve, the father, with all of his buddies. And the Mr. Rogers starts flicking on the TV, and they're like, "What the hell's going on?" And he's like, "Oh, my neighbor has the same remote," which is a really funny thing. It's not even that my neighbor has the same TV, but my neighbor has the same remote. And so they're going back and forth with clicker wars. I did think it was funny that they kept saying like, "Who is this guy on the screen?" And I'm like, "It's Mr. fucking Rogers. He's been out since 1969 or 1968. Your kids watched him, or you did. Like, who this guy is. Whatever." They're just pissed off that they can't watch football and they keep fighting over it. Um, but all of this is supposed to, again, like give you this sense of their problems are just like your problems, right? Suburban, normal people out there, your neighbor has the same clicker as you. You're trying to get beer to the football game. Your TV's messed up with your buddies, like your kids sleepwalk at night. All this kind of stuff. And you know there's a lot of that in the early setup of just all of this work to try to present this this idea of 80s suburban normalcy, which I very much equate to Spielberg just in general. Like, I think that this is one of, like, E.T. also is like huge in this respect. And it's one of the things I really dislike about his filmmaking, I have to say, too, because it it is a very sanitized, even a movie like this where, um, I mean, the parents smoke weed and, there's all this kind of stuff. Like, it's just a very lily white, like sanitized version where the issues that are going on also are not the issues that are going on in the suburbs. Like, and there's something about it that just feels so sterile and shiny, just in this way where life is just much grainier and grittier, too, that I really, dislike about the setup and the filmmaking there. But yeah.
Yeah, so when the film opened for me, first of all, I did chuckle at the national anthem. And I was like, "Oh, okay, ha 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 ha." Right, I see what you're trying to do. I actually had not remembered that part of it. On the TV turning off, I said I always think of the Lenny Williams line "Cause I Love You," and I watched TV till TV turned off. And when he does his little monologue about him missing the woman, it's such a great line in "Cause I Love You." But yeah, like I'm watching the opening, right, and the thing that immediately hits me is that I don't believe any of it. It feels like a set. Like even Craig T. Nelson's like placement, like everything is so managed. And I think one of the things that like horror or suspense is able to do is able to tap you into actually thinking that it's not plausible, but like possible in the most imaginative part of your brain. So I'm like, even with Freddy Krueger and some of those bad, lo-fi designs, I actually can get a little bit more like, that's for funky. Then watching this, it's so managed, like the slow shots, and then I have to say, my biggest biggest issue, and I don't blame Jerry Goldsmith with the film, is the music. The music is overly saturated throughout the film. It's terrible. Jerry Goldsmith's a great composer. His score in Seconds by John Frankenheimer is one of the best scores ever made, and Goldsmith's done a ton of great stuff. I don't blame him. I blame Hooper and Spielberg and Marshall for saying, have music throughout the whole damn movie at every moment. It's so managed, it's so heavy-handed, and you get these slow shots in the dog, and the way they even frame Carol Ann, it's just so much like I know she had like the perfect haircut. Like I was like, oh, y'all really take homegirl to get the nice haircut, looking like she's a runway model. Like it's just so bullshit. And I'm watching it and I'm like, you're really trying to sell me an advertisement of the suburbs. And this is where I realized like these filmmakers are so culturally out of touch. Or maybe they're not. Maybe they're that in touch with the constituency that they think is going to be buying tickets. Because maybe their assumption, and they could be correct, is that there's like the actual suburban people who have this anxiety, and then maybe like the aspirational suburban people who are like, well, we're going to work in the city until we're 40 and 50 and then move out and then like retire and then this one day be our lives. And like, is that maybe that was the promise for a certain constituency of American people? Most of them white and some of them not. Maybe some of them are, the new black bourgeoisie or the new Latino bourgeoisie coming into some money, and they can kind of like, tap into this kind of fear or anxiety. But I'm watching it and the whole thing is managed. Like, so when you get that part, I was like, okay, interesting. And I remember in my brain, I was like, I was like, this movie must kick up in gear to get scary. And then when you get the guy, you get the nice big wide shots of like the guy on like the bike with like the beer, and like the music is just dripping. And I was like, wow, this is really an Americana flick. Like this is really, and I thought I was like, am I watching E.T.? I was really just like kind of annoyed by that point. And then I do think going into football, I go, yeah, they're really trying to sell it. The clicker thing was funny because one thing I do remember about those clickers, a lot of them weren't made for the televisions. When they were made, they were third party, so they would just
program
control
them.
yeah, and they didn't even control like other appliances that had remote control technology, right? You turn that off and your stereo goes off or something like that, and I did find that funny. But like the whole kind of first section, it's like white bread. It's like the white bread Americana. And what could be interesting, and I actually think in a way Wes Craven does it better in this kind of way, is like, okay, well, let's see them get terrorized. But what Craven does is their terror actually comes from the families, right? The shit that the families is doing. There is a person, it's the corporate person that will later learn. But like I'm watching it and I'm like, you want me clearly to empathize. And it's the heavy-handedness of first cinema Hollywood, that they're so heavy-handed in telling you who you need to empathize for. And it's not just the people, it's a certain ideology of America. And, now I know why, in the Soviet Union and places, they used to make fun of movies like this in their TV commercials, right? Because they're so fucking ridiculous.
Yeah, absolutely. Somebody talked about it being really terrifying in the cinema, especially the clown in the closet and the stacked chairs. I can see that. Like, the clown, I think, is one of the scarier parts of the film to me. And also that, we'll get there, but like at the ending,
The clown in the tree.
the tree. Yeah. I mean it. Yeah. Um, I think the other things, I guess I would say, just quickly in terms of setting the scene, um, Tweety dies, right? So you see the bird is keeled over and mom's about to flush it. Carol Ann walks in. Carol Ann, determines that this bird needs to have a proper burial in a cigar box in the backyard. Um, which is funny because it was probably the cigar box that they were smoking weed in. She talks about the smell of it, and at first I was like, oh, she's probably talking tobacco, but it's right the night before they're like rolling joints, out of the cigar box. Um, you get, or actually that's the following night, but you get the Darth Vader poster. You get, Robbie reading Captain America. Robbie's the youngest boy. The three children. Carol Ann is the little girl, blonde haired. Robbie is like, I think the actor is 10 years old, so that's about how old he is in the film. And then Dana, who's the teenager who you barely see, which I actually think is fairly accurate. I mean, having a teenager now, I barely see him, and he doesn't even get to go out as much as Dana does. So, that's fair. The Darth Vader poster, leave the closet light on for the kids. I mean, these things are kind of, I think, staples of both 80s, but also things I very much remember, and I don't. I'm not sure, what why, right? Like whether my parents got them from their parents or from TV or from, whatever. But like there's a lot of these kind of things. Yeah, parents go smoke weed and watch A Guy Named Joe, which is like a Spencer Tracy film, with the line that says, either I'm dead or I'm crazy. And then the guy says, well, you're not crazy, Pete. And then the
That
mom,
was a
but
Spielberg. That was a deliberate Spielberg. He said he used to watch that movie as a kid, and that kind of goes into also one of Spielberg's favorite things is Americana nostalgia that he never investigates, and that's another annoying kind of quality with him. He uses nostalgia as this kind of like latching point, but he never investigates the nature of nostalgia, what it does to push ideology for it, because he has no care for ideology. He isn't that deep of a thinker. I'm sorry, Jay, go ahead.
no, you're right. And you see that in this film too. Yeah, and Robbie's afraid of the tree. He's afraid of the clown. He throws his Chewbacca jacket over the clown. Like, there's a lot of Star Wars stuff, which I'm sure is Spielberg, like, helping out. George Lucas was a little product placement, throughout it. His good buddy.
George was about to put them toys out in about a year. The Ewoks, the era of the toys was coming out. I'm sure George called him, said, "Hey, homie,
Yeah,
hook it up."
Well, and again, he's doing the effects, right? So I'm sure this was like part of the, like, maybe the deal was a little bit better as he's like, we'll give you some product placement throughout this film. Robbie's afraid of the storm. So this is big storms. I mean, and this is throughout the film. There's these huge storms. And he's afraid to the degree where he walks in on his father and mother as the father is doing Donald Duck noise foreplay, I guess you could say. And you know, basically Steve, the father, goes in. How many seconds do you count, as the lightning's going further away, which again is a classic thing, like, oh, 1 second per 1 mile. If it's getting further away, you'll be able to count further and further. And of course, the problem is that Robbie can't count further and further because the storm's getting closer. And so it ends with the kids both falling asleep in the parents' bed, basically. And they wake up to basically an earthquake. So Carol Ann wakes up first, goes to the static, right? Crawls towards the TV again. Ghost comes out of the TV. You see it go into the walls, and this causes like an earthquake. And that's when she delivers the line, "They're here." And that kind of, you know, ends that scene. The next thing I would say is the following morning. So this is when you start to get the movement of the furniture and all of that. And this is when they really realize, like, oh, we've got a real problem here. But the funniest part about this next scene is Carol Ann is staring at the screen and there's static on it in the morning still. And the mom says, "Oh, honey, you're going to ruin your eyes. This is no good for you." And so she changes it and puts on this Western, which is like everybody's getting blown up, like extreme violence. And obviously, this is, I guess, where one of the social commentary or whatever that comes in the film. And there is an interesting thing. I mean, I think this is one of the elements of this film is this critique of television, right? Which goes throughout it, which sometimes is a little bit abstract, right? Because the TV is part of this like portal to the spirit world sort of thing, but also this this recognition of, you know, don't stare at the static, it's going to hurt your eyes, but then put on some ultra violent thing and walk away, right? And it's funny, but there is that, and it'll come up a few other points in the film, and it actually, I think, leads to some better films that then kind of take that little kernel of a critique within this movie and do things that are a little bit more direct in terms of critiquing, like what is TV doing to our society and our children's brains, and what do we feel about this idiot box and the propaganda that comes out of it. But this film doesn't, again, it doesn't go there. It's just sort of like this ubiquitous nature of TV within the film, where they literally never turn the TVs off, right? Especially once Carol Ann is sucked into the other world and they can hear her through the TV potentially. But yeah.
Yeah, I always have taken the TV thing as like a comment on like the kind of the child neglect. If you sit your child in front of the TV and have them have the TV take care of your child. And look, I think any parent, including myself, who has grown up in or grew up or now raises a kid in the TV or screens era, has this anxiety, right? Am I showing my child too much TV or screen or internet or computer? It's a thing that's like in all of ours, so you can immediately tap. But even before I watched this, it always, because of the kind of social zeitgeist around that, it always made me look at Craig T. Nelson and Joe Beth Williams as like neglectful parents. Like there was a certain level of neglect that they had over their kids, because in this like new modern parenting that exists. But like I said, like I'm with you, Jay. Like the comment, the TV comment is not really that deep or that rounded. It doesn't have a lot of legs to it. It's like it's a simplistic device. And then I'm just gonna say a shout out to Videodrome, because you want to get a movie that talks about TV and uses the idea of the waves and the super. Come on, like
We got to do that one. Yeah.
yeah. Just throw Cronenberg's all his great movies at Spielberg and he just knocks down. But like the way Videodrome explores the idea of like how it actually physiologically will change human beings in this kind of body horror concept, like that's some real shit. Like this, I think, yeah, it does tap into that anxiety. And I think that is part of the fear, right? I think that we get to the kid kidnapping fears. Like they don't have to be placed literally, right? You having these like social anxieties around children being kidnapped and all that type of stuff. We talked about it with Nightmare. You can like displace it like a few steps. So when people watch it, they may not be making that immediate connection, but like it can kind of be drawn up. Like my daughter is missing. Like when we'll talk about the scene where they finally do get Carol Ann into the closet and all that type of stuff, the way it's even set up, they do have to neglect her, right? Because they're going to go get Robbie, right? So they do have to somewhat neglect her, and because they neglect her, she's the one who gets sacrificed to go inside of the spirit world, the demon world, the other side. That's the word, the other side, which starts to bring up my atheism, and we'll talk about that.
Yeah, and I will say, like, again, that's a little abstract in the film, but I do think that's a real anxiety that parents have and a real issue that parents deal with, of when you have multiple kids and one of your kids needs like more of your attention, or you really, that this is what causes like all of those. This is why kids need therapy, right? It's like, because like your younger brother comes along or your younger sister comes along and suddenly she needs all of this, or somebody's going through something and they need the support, and the other kids are like, what about me, right? And it's a struggle for parents to balance that, and it is a struggle also that is made worse in my opinion, pulling out my Luddite, characteristics, by, technology, certainly now by smartphones, but also in the 80s by something like, the how ubiquitous TV became, right? And this way that, like, I guess the early stages of what we now call the attention economy, the ways that all of these other things come for you that pull you away from giving attention to your kids. And I think this is also very much an 80s anxiety, right? Associated, again, stoked by the false panic that every child in the suburbs is being kidnapped, or that there's all these other, that students, the whole teen panic, around students, or not students, I keep saying students, around young people losing their moral center, right? The loss of the Christian church as a place that's central to all the like all of these kind of anxieties that come out in the 80s that very much also are tied into the Reagan administration as well, which I think is part of it that's kind of interesting within this film, because there's a way you could read this film as a critique of Reagan, but there's also ways where I think the politics of the film are very Reaganite, around the need for the nuclear family to kind of overcome all of these ways that they're being sort of torn apart by the the whatever, like the problems of modern society or something like that, something very vague and nebulous like that, and that what needs to happen is this restoration of the family unit. And I think that politics is like firmly within this film.
So yeah, I thought about that on a similar vein about the Reagan thing. I if I'm thinking Spielberg at his most, like what I know about him and I've read, I didn't hear anything specifically about this film and his politics. There's a way that he would leave. I trust that he would leave this purposefully a bit opaque, where he would understand that he's going to have a mix of the kind of socially wanting to be socially mobile or the aspirationally socially mobile white or American family, that they could have the read kind of go in a pro Reagan, that Reagan can deliver this or Reagan can't deliver this, right? Type of thing, or this era of Reagan can or can't. I think he wanted to leave it open in that kind of way so they all could participate in it, because his whole thing is about the American family, which, if my assumptions are correct, and look, I don't know Spielberg, I can't read his brain, I don't have any direct quotations. I do know things he said about politics in the past and how he situates himself around the idea of politics in movies and taking political positions. He would look to do that because he would want to kind of include all, which just shows liberalism. And I say it with like the classical L, that kind of idea that like you need to have like the huge tent pole for the entire American. It's, it's bourgeois democracy nonsense, right? And he would totally kind of have that character. And it's funny because then we go, and probably could step into it, like when we first see the ghosts, or not see, we see the ghosts doing activity. So Joe Beth Williams begins to recognize that the ghosts are there with like the changing of the chairs. She understands that Carol Ann is like talking to something on like the TV and communicating. She's seeing stuff, and her little daughter is the conduit to them. I have to say, I've grown an annoyance for the trope of like the kid being the one who can see the ghost. It's this thing that's so overused, and maybe I'm being mean to Poltergeist because maybe they were one of the early ones to do it, right? And the later ones just kicked it off too much. But the trope to me is quite lazy, and it kind of shows it's less about the kid and it's more about this idea of like ghosts or aliens, that there's some, even though they might have more developed powers, they're actually like developmentally less, since they only can talk to kids, right? So like ghosts or aliens are like a low level of like, I don't know, liberal or enlightenment development, right, to a certain degree. right? Because if you notice in certain movies, something like Contact, they wouldn't go talk to a kid. They go talk to Jodie Foster, who's a scientist, right? So they would have it differently in that kind of way. I don't like Contact either. I think it's a really shitty movie.
I
But
fucking hate that movie.
I
Yeah, go
fucking
ahead.
hate that movie. Imperial 90s. Woo, what a terrible piece of shit. But in this movie, they you notice there is this like way I think they have this kind of idea is juvenile, right? Which I think also characterizes how they think of like the vindictive ghost, which we're not quite there yet. We'll talk about that, but it's part of it. But anyway, seeing it, and then you have the sequences with the kind of the chairs, right? So she notices that the chairs are like misplaced, and then she goes and the chairs come back, and so forth and so on, and like they're like restacked in different ways, and it's like a clever filming trick. And there's another part where the music to me made it worse. I felt like if they would have cut a lot of the score down and just let it actually breathe out, there's like an inability to trust the audience. They're treating us like children, like we can't have an emotion. But I think they also really want you to kind of like have a particular kind of emotion, so they want to like hammer it home to you. So you get all that. You also get that juxtapose, which I think is actually very important with Craig T. Nelson's work as a real estate agent or develop. What do you think? Was he like an agent essentially?
Yeah, I mean, so he sells the properties of
Right.
the development, right? And so I don't know technically whether his title is a realtor or a real estate agent, but he is. I mean, that's we learn later more about it, and you get that scene here in the early where he walks a family into a home, and they're kind of like they like it, but they're like every house here looks exactly the same. He talks about he was phase 1, this is phase 4, and of the same big development. And uh they after they make the comment about everything looking similar, he's like, well, the construction standards are very liberal. He's like, I know this family that has a jacuzzi in their bedroom with like an aqueduct that runs down to their backyard and all of this stuff. And so I found that part funny. I mean, you're supposed to think that he's this great real estate salesman who we learn later has sold 41% of the properties in all of Cuesta Verde. But it's also this funny commentary, a little bit of like, why do all these houses look exactly the same? And it's like, but you could have a jacuzzi in your bedroom, and if you want, like, so it's very much selling this American dream, quote unquote, that is both very homogenous, right? But like then you can innovate on it with your jacuzzi, your personal appliances, right? Which is also, I think, a very 80s thing, right? Like having a jacuzzi, getting a pool, which is of course the family's thing and all that stuff. Yeah.
But there's also a communism anxiety around that. The whole idea of the planned economy, right? And the planned area, right? One of these things with certain movies, I think this movie doesn't do it too much, but you can watch a movie like movies that have the suburban fear that everyone is the same, right? So like the whole liberal fear that you're going to all get into kind of sameness, which is often used as a kind of anti-communist fear, right? The fact that communism wants to take away your individuality. So one of the interesting things, and I thought that was an interesting kind of comment in the film, because this essentially is a planned community, right? Like they have these things, they build it, right? So like he has to kind of assure them that, look, you still can have your individuality, and you can have it in the Americana. You can have the jacuzzi, like not like you could have a different like color. Like you could have like, this is still America. This is still high end, right? This is still like, the promise that we've gone to. It's different than like maybe your initial concept of having like a certain type of house, but this is a new concept, but it's still right embedded in like the kind of liberal tradition of like individuality, even though everything looks the same. I know it's a little weird. Don't worry, it's not going to be Stepford Wives, right? Or something like that. Like you're not that's not going to happen to you. I found that sequence like pretty interesting. And it becomes bigger, I think, in later movies throughout the 80s and even into the 90s, actually.
Yeah. So I know you talked about it a little bit, but the chair thing, I did there. That is one of the more, I think, to some level, enjoyable scenes when they're like sliding. They figure out that they can slide stuff along the kitchen floor, and they put Carol Ann in the football helmet and slide her along the floor. And Steve comes home right after selling properties all day, and uh, the first thing Carol Ann says is, "Mommy didn't cook any dinner." Again, which is like, yeah, I mean, typical gender roles, expectations, all of that, but also, again, that kind of theme of the parents aren't really following through on their family duties. But she says, "We'll go to Pizza Hut, okay?" Right? And then Carol Ann's like, "I want a pepperoni pizza." As she's sliding across the floor or whatever. Um, and yeah, I mean, and then you get the scene where they go outside to the neighbors and ask if they've had any disturbances lately, which is a really funny scene as well. But yeah.
And I will say those two scenes I felt were the most believable scenes in the entire film. Because I do think if, like, granted, I don't believe in those things personally. Like, I'm not a ghost or something like that. But if something like that did happen, I could see myself or my lady having a similar reaction. Like, yo, what the fuck? Like, it's happening. Do you see this? Right? Like, it seemed like the appropriate parent thing where I wouldn't be feeding my kid. I want some food. I'm like, no, you gotta slide on
Totally.
that ground. Right? You gotta
Totally.
slide on that ground and check that out.
I don't know if I would send. I will say this: I don't think I would send my kid across it. I would be working with inanimate devices personally and being a little bit
First,
worried about like
some
what
parents
is
would
gonna
though. I feel like my
what's
mom would
gonna
have did
possess
that.
what's gonna possess my child if I put them across this mystical portal. Like, you know, I'm resistant enough to the powers of spiritual forces that I would be concerned with that. Um, but I would say that the go to Pizza Hut thing too, I have to take a moment here and just pour out a little liquor for one of the great 80s, things in Americana, which Pizza Hut in the 80s, like this is me doing my like Vince McMahon like tearing up moment of you know, there was a salad bar that had like different sauces and all kinds of stuff. You had pitchers, right? And this was also all pizza parlors in the 80s sort of had a setup similar to this. But also just the pizza parlor, right? Like, and then there were video games. Like we had one in Medford that I would go to where the downstairs was all the dining area and then the full upstairs was just an arcade, and we would go there, and it was just beg your parents for dollars to put in the change machine so that you could play whatever video games. And during the Land Before Time era, they had great puppets from Littlefoot and everything. And I mean, just some of the best times of my life were at Pizza Hut in the late 80s, early 90s. And so I deeply relate to Carol Ann, and shout out to the mom, Diane, for agreeing to take her family there on such a momentous occasion, because yeah, it was beautiful times.
Yeah, I grew up in New York City, so I'm culturally trained to hate Pizza Hut. Like it's
The
part
the pizza is absolutely horrible, but it has nothing to do with the pizza. The
the whole
pizza is,
tradition.
yeah.
Yeah. It's just the whole tradition. So we would go to the actual pizza shop in your neighborhood to get the pizza and sit there with the Italian homies who were making your pizza. But no, I was culturally trained to like no Pizza Hut, Domino's, evil places, suburbia. Honestly, like that's like one of the things that we equated with suburbia, and we like shook our head at suburban people. Like, you eat that shit, man? You go to there? Like, I remember the first time I had to kind of go to one visiting my cousins, and I was just like absolutely just like, ugh, right. But I thought the scene with the neighbors was real because like how do you do that? Like, how do you go like, yo, there's some wild shit happening? And I really want to know if you are seeing it, but like I don't really get on with you too tough. Right? Like you like they never actually ask, right? I don't think they ever really ask them. I think it's like it just kind of is, they kind of get around it. And I was like, this is actually an accurate scene. Like I can this made sense to me. I watched it. It's funny. I started having slight hope for the movie by this point. I was like, oh, maybe the movie just gets better. Maybe it has a bad kind of opening and like it gets a little bit more engaging. And so that scene, there was an accuracy for me in it. And then because then you get to the next night or the third night or whatever. I can't remember what, maybe it's the third night where the abduction kind of happens, right? And yeah,
It's
and I thought, go ahead.
it's later that same night, I think.
Same
Actually,
night, but that's kind of what I mean. But that's what I
yeah,
mean. Isn't it's like the third night? They have like three. Like it's like a first night where they see the TV. Then it's like the next one, right? And I don't
right.
know. Maybe I'm
You're right.
wrong.
Third night.
Right.
You're right.
Right.
Yeah, that's 3. Yep.
So they're there, and like you see, like and it's funny. Like I go back and forth because I do agree. The clown is like nicely set. It's like a scary thing, and the tree. But then like the lighting, I felt like the lighting was just so overdone. I was like pulled back like 30 seconds, like a little bit. And I have a pretty good TV, it's nice and big, and I'm watching it, and I'm like, the lighting. I mean, I couldn't stop realizing that I was watching a set. Like they it's something that Spielberg that I really, it doesn't work for me. Like he doesn't understand to like rub off the edges a little bit. Like he's so excessive in his design that it takes me out. It actually ends up doing the opposite of what he wants us to do, right? And then you get into this kind of big thing, and like and around the kids, and then trying to get the kid. So they're trying to go for the son with like the tree, and it like takes him out the thing, which then leaves Carol Ann vulnerable, right? They go and they have to go try to rescue the kid out the tree, and this big sequence. And like a lot of Spielberg fans, like I don't really feel like talking about the ins and outs of the action sequences. I mean, sure, they probably have meanings here and there, but not really. Also, like it's just like pinpoint action. It's not really that dynamic. I don't find a dynamic with it as much as like it's like great. It's big spectacle. I'm going to say great, but it's big spectacle. But Carol Ann essentially gets sucked into the closet, right? And she goes into the closet, which becomes the portal to go into the other side. Which really becomes like the big kind of centering of the movie, that there's like two sides, right? And I will say this is where my atheism began to kick in a little bit, because I struggle with these concepts as I've gotten older, because I've found them to be concepts, from my personal experience, and this is just my life, I don't want to like put it on everybody else, and I respect people's beliefs. I found it ways to not deal with shit that's happening here. And it's really so like I begin to get a bit of a wall when everything gets explained in these kind of like two portal fronts. And I'm kind of like, all right. So like, yeah, like it was starting to kick in. But that's like in ways that other movies it doesn't kick in, But for this movie, it began to kick in because I could feel a certain kind of theological positioning about to like step in, and I was like, okay, this will be interesting how I continue.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I didn't have that reaction. I mean, my relationship to, I do have a relationship to Christianity that is like what I would describe as basically agnostic at this point. But I also am not I'm not an atheist, right? But it's funny, what the reason I bring that up is I didn't read this movie as a very spiritual one, other than obviously there's the clear spiritual question about like, should you, like, what might happen to you if you deface an entire graveyard and like leave the bodies in your backyard and this kind of stuff. Which I recognize is a spiritual question, but also I think is a way to talk about certain things within the material history as well, which the film doesn't really do. And I think there's actually some interesting ways. People brought up, we're talking about this on Indigenous Peoples Day, which actually we didn't actually plan that, but this is obviously fortuitous for this particular movie. But I'm going to save my comments on that for a minute because I think that there's actually a very intentional way that this movie sidesteps dealing with that history quite deliberately in the script itself and in the film itself. Um, but the part that's where I get the two sides thing that you talked about, like, it actually reminds me a lot of another series which is about to restart again, which is Stranger Things, right? Like this idea of the upside down. And I mean, that's one of the kind of strange aspects of this film is obviously there are spirits in the film that are people, right? But there's also the beast, right? There's also this kind of supernatural monster sort of. And I don't know what to them that's supposed to symbolize. But it and I guess one of the interesting things spiritually about the film a little bit is that it does deal with this question, which I know is one within African spiritualities as well, too, of transition, right? Because the idea of these families is, as we learn through the parapsychologist, which is a whole other thing that will be fun to talk about, um, that the reason that they are haunted, right, is because these people basically haven't gone into the afterlife, right? That they have stayed within some transitional spiritual plane that is in between death and actually, in their mind, like heaven, right? Which is, but yeah, so that's there too. Um and that's what they're grappling with in the film. But it's actually interesting because it I don't know. I There's a part of it for me that's more, I guess, sci-fi to some certain extent within the kind, and I think that's the connection probably for me to other work by Spielberg, that it doesn't feel to me like there's anything really spiritual going on within the film. I don't know if that makes sense to people, but it feels there's not a lot brought in to actually deal with spirituality or spiritual questions, or you know the meaning, or what actually, it's dealt with in a kind of, there are these realms that exist in layers and people get trapped in them. But it sidesteps a lot of discussion, I think, around spirituality and religion as well.
No, you're right. It's quasi and like it's very like kind of like, kind of in the air and amorphous. It's interesting. It made me think of like, I don't know. I'm trying to think of a film that has like a distinct spiritual element, even in like the positive or the specific, that I accept. So, like, I remember when I was watching like some Ben's Emite, right? And there's like a sequence with like I guess they would be like the spiritual leaders where they're talking to like the gods, right? And they're having these arguments with the gods, like even when that film has a very, and Sam Ben was an atheist as well. Maybe it could be partly why I was like akin to it. But Sam Ben does have a respect for tradition. So in the sense that he would sit it in a sense that like, look, the gods in his head do exist, right? They're a part of our history. So that thing is real. So when I watch it, I'm like, oh yeah, like, and they're having this thing right now. There's like a conflict that he has with the gods, right? And like the whole like practice of it. And I was like, okay, cool. Also, so this works for me. When I'm watching this, the entire thing is just so like just poking at like all the like lazy signifiers, like go to the other side, go to the light, come to this way. The spiritual woman, which we'll get to, who basically knows everything and can figure out everything in 10 minutes how to get your daughter out of the other side. That shit just it reminds me of all the simple answers that people that I've always had conflict with, kind of faux spiritualism, faux religion, have always bothered the shit out of me, right? and people can just make up whatever they want. And I also think it makes for bad movie making, because then you essentially have to hold yourself to no standard. You can shift everything to where you want. It's why I hate the multiverse. I feel like the multiverse is just a new spiritualism in movies, right? It's why I couldn't get into everything everywhere all at once. You can just make up new shit on the fly because you don't want to really deal with anything actually material. And like that's what this movie begins to do. It just makes up new shit on the fly as it goes through, with the kind of like center focus to be, you must empathize with the family really through these two parents, really through Jo Beth Williams mostly. And it just gets tiresome, right? For me, I the wall just goes up, and I'm like, it's not happening, y'all done lost me.
Yeah. No, I get it. So next, Diane, the mother, she finally can hear Carol Ann's voice, and she's trying to figure out where it is. Because again, Carol Ann has gone through the closet, but the parents don't figure that out, because when they go in, they kind of think she's in the closet. There's all this crap that has been sucked into the closet, like everything in the room basically has been sucked into the closet. But they pull it all out. There's a sheet or a blanket covering something that they think might be Carol Ann, and they're worried that Carol Ann has been crushed for a minute. And they pull the blanket off, and it's the clown. This fucking clown. I hate that clown. And then they start looking around the house everywhere, hear her voice, and finally they realize that it's coming from the TV, which again, like, this is where there is something a little bit interesting, little bit, not well developed. As you said, I think it's good to think of it as a device, right? Rather than actually a critique or something that you can solidly, um, you know, build an analysis around, because I don't think that they're thinking about it in terms of some sustained analysis of television. They're really thinking, how do we use the television as a device within this film? And so you can hear her voice coming through the static, and at this point it switches. You have the next day, they're going to UC Irvine. I mean, I don't think it actually labels it as that way, but that's where it is. It's the Lanson Library at UC Irvine that they go to. And they go to this Department of Popular Beliefs, Superstitions, and Parapsychology, which I don't think is a real thing. There are no professional departments. I mean, it's kind of weird how it's dealt with in the film, because the woman who's the professor even says basically that, like, parapsychology is not really a real field. I have to do this like on the side. Um, but at the same time, it is actually stated on the front of her office in this university library that it is a department of popular beliefs, superstitions, and parapsychology. So I guess what they're saying is that it's a department maybe that's critical of those things, right? Or like teaches the history of these different areas of basically faux psychology, right? And so they go to them, and they're interested in, like, oh, can we test your home for disturbances? Which is like kind of it's a funny thing. Like, I do find this part a little bit funny, although it bothers me slightly, because there is a certain thing here, I think, where you and I are in agreement, which is like there's this, I consider, huckster industry of people who, ghost hunters, like all this kind of stuff, where they go around and they try to present these houses and like do like long-term motion capture stuff and all of this, and try to document the existence of ghosts, right? Or other supernatural forces. And actually a lot of that industry, gains traction again through shit I hate, like the History Channel, and like all of these kind of, the Ted Turner industrial complex, like all of this stuff that goes on to make these shows that, becomes a whole industry. People watch this stuff and get, totally believe in it and all of this kind of stuff. And So they're and it's funny when they go to their house. First, Steve says, we don't really care about the disturbances. We want our daughter back, which obviously it makes sense as a parent. Like you're going. One of the things I do have to say that's interesting within this film is there's no involvement of the police at any point. And they actually talk about how they don't want to make a big deal out of it and all of this, which I did find odd. I mean, I found it odd as a suburban white, you know, ethic that I just haven't really experienced in my life of suburban whites being like, we don't want to talk about the police. I mean, I did wonder if like maybe they're worried about the fact that they smoke pot or something like that, or if they're just worried about because he works for the company that develops the towns that like they don't want to, make a kind of media thing. And I think that you could sort of understand that maybe for a little bit, but once your daughter's been kidnapped by something, you would think that there would be some, reach out to the police or the FBI or something like that along those lines. And they never do that. They go straight to, we need ghost hunters, basically. And so you have that. They go to them, they come into the house. There's kind of a funny scene where what's the name of the I'm trying to think of the name of the character.
Which
There's
one
so
plays?
there's Dr. Lesh, um, and then there's two other guys. There's Marty and then Ryan.
Mm-hmm.
And again, like this is also where the film gets it to me is like becomes Ghostbusters, um, proto Ghostbusters, right? Because you have this multiracial, group of ghost hunters coming into the house with a bunch of equipment. And, Ryan tells a story of like one time I took a motion capture of a matchbox, car going 7 feet over 7 hours or something like that, imperceptible to the eye, but I caught it on video. And they open up the kids' room and like shit is like flying all around and there's records. The record like pops onto the record player, starts playing. You get books opening up and all the pages turning, the beds circulating around. And clearly they have these ghosts, these parapsychologists have never seen anything like this in their life, right? I mean, there's a funny part of it too, because in a little ways they're kind of poking fun at what a quack industry all of this is, that they've been doing this for years and they've actually never really encountered actual spiritual activity like this. But on the other end, they're just like, oh, they don't know what to do, basically, given all of what's going on, although they have ideas. But yeah, and this becomes like a lot of the plot from here on is kind of this, bringing different people in, trying different things to, try to get Carol Ann back. And then after eventually they get Carol Ann back, but yeah.
Yeah, and I definitely had that thought too, and it made me wonder how much of the kind of spiritual hunter stuff predated this stuff in like the kind of maybe even suburban culture, like things that people were doing maybe in secret. Like I did hear read about after The Exorcist there was a rise, and I don't know how big of a rise it was, but they said there was like this like kind of like thing where like people were going to their pastors and saying, "Is my daughter or my son possessed?" And then the pastor happened to go, "No, they're not possessed. You just not pay attention to your kid." You know what I'm saying? And then I'm sure also maybe there was a section of people who would try to do that, or maybe, but a rise in those kinds of beliefs. So I wonder, but I always wondered, like, did it predate it? Because then that did happen in the 80s and like and then things like Amityville, people like worried that their houses were haunted and stuff like that, and possessions and stuff like that, and like bringing people over to kind of throw the stuff over and like clean your. I mean, this is also a phrase. I'm not just using this phrase. They actually say clean your house, right? To do like the kind of cleanse of these like spirits, So I wondered that when I was watching it. But yeah, in here is where the movie like really start to get the wall for me, because it's the language that's starting to hit me, like things like come into the light and all these types of things, right? Uh, Making it into kind of ideas of like frequencies and like the different dimensions and like for me it can be an interesting push and pull cinematically, but it just gets very thin after a while. So I found myself like really struggling, even though like Beatrice Straight, who plays like the lead person, I always like her acting. She's great in her one long scene in Network, super long scene she won an Oscar for. She always makes a joke. She made a joke about it that they gave me an Oscar for one scene, but she's great in it, and I can watch her do her stuff. And it's interesting to watch Richard Lawson, but like it's like this, it's like the Spielbergian spectacle when like the ghost comes down, that I was getting Close Encounters vibes with that, like you're getting this whole thing, and I'm asking myself, well, what is actually happening here? You just kind of want to get me drunk in this kind of visual spectacle. Is that when she runs through the daughter? She runs through me, I can feel her. Did that happen already? Does that happen in this sequence, or does that happen later? I can't
Yeah,
remember.
no, I mean it roughly does. I mean,
Yeah.
you also get the scene where Marty comes down and he's been bitten basically by
Yeah.
the beasts,
Right.
and then a little later on, he gets hungry and he goes in and he sees the steak moving across the counter, and then the steak kind of opens up and like is I didn't actually see maggots. Maybe they were there, but it just sort of is like it's like consuming itself from within. There's clearly something.
Yeah.
And then he looks down and this drumstick that he's been eating out of is full of maggots, and goes into the bathroom, and his face starts to fall apart, and weirdly he just starts peeling it apart and basically ripping pieces of it off. It is one of the more gross scenes in the movie. And then of course he just like wakes up basically, and none
Right.
of that is actually real.
Is messing with his brain, right? And that's true, because like the movie for like the next like 20 to 30 minutes before the it's really everything before the scene where the boss reveals to Craig T. Nelson what has happened unwittingly to a certain degree. What has basically taken place with the building of these places. Um, it's in this push and pull of like trying to figure out what's happening. Do they really believe it? But a lot of the conversation is really focused around like this idea of family and like love and and connection and for me, the interesting part of what I would like it to do, like if you're going to do a spiritual film about these things, like this is where I'm kind of like, I actually want to know about the people on the other side. I actually don't really care about all this. I want to know what they are, who they are, and why, especially when I find out who they are in about 20 minutes. I then retroactively go, well, fuck all that other stuff. Why haven't you been exploring this? And it begins to kind of, I think, what you're talking about, how this film wants to deliberately ignore practices, because even when they do address it, it's not even addressed that well, right? They want to ignore practices and focus you around the idea of the family, the nuclear family, protecting your family through the mother and the father, and what is the duty of the family, and all those type of things.
Yeah. So I want to go into that section, and I have a lot of thoughts about it. I'm sure you do too. Um, so I guess the only other thing is in that kind of night before scene that the scene we were just talking about, where all this different stuff is going on. They're in the house, they're being confronted by the spirits and stuff like that. That there is this moment where they actually see like this light coming downstairs, and they've captured it on film. And as they rewatch it on film, you can actually see some of the people. And I didn't notice this much first watching it, but when you watch closely, you see that these are upper middle class people. Like they have like, Easter hat type stuff on. Like they're kind of like decked out white people really that are coming in the spirits, right? Um and that becomes, I think, really important to what the film is doing, and actually the messaging, if there is, and the kind of de-radicalizing of any of the potentiality of what it could be in terms of a critique. So next you get Mr. Teague, who's the boss of Steve. He comes out the next day. At this point, they're sending Robbie away to stay with his grandmother. The older daughter Dana is like just off sleeping with friends anyways. Like they just basically let her go, and Dana has a very small role in the film actually, the teen. But Teague wants to, you know, he's trying to pull Steve back in and it's kind of weird. I don't quite understand the time transition that's supposed to happen because it's sort of implied that he hasn't been into work for quite some time, but yet when we saw it, he was just like 2 days ago, at least in what we see in the film, he was selling houses for him. So there's, I guess, some passage of time that we're supposed to recognize, but it's not actually, sort of stated. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm also going to say I do think the film also just has bad narrative issues. It's very rudderless and it's very jagged. I would imagine there was a lot of cuts that happened, but it structurally it actually just has script problems because I caught the same thing. It doesn't really make sense in the timeline of how they put it together, and you have to make a lot of assumptions that I don't think that they structurally do very well. I imagine the film was probably cut probably about a half an hour, 45 minutes. Spielberg has historically, especially early in his career, had that issue that he would overshoot and they would have to do a lot of cutting.
Yeah. So, anyways, I mean, so Teague is like taking him up on the hill, right? And I wrote all of this kind of dialogue down because I think it's important. So, he says, "All of this could be your master bedroom suite. This could be your view." He's like, "How would this part be for a bay window, right?" And you at this point you don't see what's around them. They're looking down the hill, right? So, you know, Craig T. Nelson, Steve, the father, he's sort of like hemming and hawing, saying, "Well, that sounds nice, but the people down there, they'd have to look up at this development on the hill. That wouldn't be such a great view for them. It'd be a great view from up here, kind of thing." And Teague's like, "Well, you wouldn't have to worry about that because you'd be up here, right?" And he says, "You're responsible for 42% of sales. That's almost half of everything down there, almost 70 million worth of dwelling and properties. Now, that's a whole generation of security that nobody can put a price tag on." Steve turns, and we now see the other side of the white picket fence that they've been walking along, because you see the fence behind them, but you don't see what's on the other side of the fence for a lot of the shot. And it's this massive cemetery, right? This big cemetery. And Steve says, not much room for a pool, is there? Like, which of course we should say, because that's actually important to the whole film, that they've been building a pool. They've had guys at their house digging that out and preparing it and all of this. And Steve turns, and yeah, he says, "There's not much room for a pool up here." Mr. Teague says, "We own all the land. We've already made arrangements for relocating the cemetery." And Steve says, "Oh, you're kidding. Oh, come on. I mean, that's sacrilegious, isn't it?" And he says, and so this is what Mr. Teague replies. He says, "Oh, don't worry about it. I mean, after all, it's not ancient tribal burial ground. It's just people. Besides, we've done it before." So I wanted to pause there, right? Because I think this is really important. Like, there is a way we could have a read of this film that it is about capitalism and settler colonialism, right? That the actual people, are enslaved people, are indigenous people who constitute all of these burial grounds that have been built over the top of by the capitalist real estate industry through all of this, right? So you could really draw, there could be a version of this film, I think, that could be actually really dope, because you could actually like do that thing of you know the settlers, the white upper middle class, the participants in this imperial project, the ones who, derive certain benefits from it as well due to their class position, um, that they, are being haunted by sort of the memories of everything that they have done, right? Um, but it's not that. Like we saw the people, they were not indigenous, looking. There was no attempt to make them look that way. There's no attempt to make them look like, African folks who've been killed, like none of that. It is that a prior generation of white people have been that they have been desecrated, right, in order to make for this suburb. And I mean, there's something interesting in Teague sort of saying they're just normal people so that they don't matter, which like maybe leaves space for some weird critique of whiteness, right? And how like white people don't actually care about, their ancestors or something like that, um but it does, take away kind of other things that we could do with this movie that actually might be, neat and potentially, anti-imperialist or solidaristic in certain ways. Um, so then Steve asks, when did you do that before? And Teague says, in 76, right down there. And Steve says, Cuesta Verde. And Teague says, all 300 acres. And let me tell you, it was quite a deal. Steve, no, but I've never heard anything about it, though. And Teague says, well, it's not the sort of thing one goes around advertising on a billboard or on the side of a bus. What are you worried about? Friends and relatives can visit their loved ones in Broxton Memorial Park. It's only 5 minutes further, for Christ's sake. Steve, oh, yeah. Well, 5 minutes, that's no great hardship. I suppose that would be okay. Teague says, okay with whom? And Steve sighs, whomever might complain. And Teague says, nobody's complained until now. Which again, I do think that there's a little bit there of a critique of something quite depraved and rotten within American society, that like we did this shit and nobody complained about it. Like that, that we already have relocated a cemetery and we will do it again to build this development of all these, multi-million dollar development, 70 million plus just in Steve's portion of the sales. And then nobody complained about it at all. Even as they've replaced, as an old friend of mine used to say, perfectly good white people, moved them out of, their burial ground somewhere else. But yeah, it's a tricky, it's an interesting thing where I think it's not, there's a lot you could do it that they don't do.
So part of me wonders if this was a suggestion that maybe Hooper made or drove that went wrong. Because the bigger plot of one of the plots of Texas Chainsaw Massacre is about the people from the cities, even people who have a certain level of privilege, ignoring kind of certain sectors of society and ignoring the kind of horrors and then having to be confronted with those kinds of horrors. But of course, it's done in a much more intense way in Texas Chainsaw Massacre than in this. Because I caught that too. When I'm watching it, I'm like, oh, really? This is where you're gonna go? Because it's weird. I didn't remember the film as specifically, and I think a part of me, well, I'm also connecting part two, which I think even makes it worse. If you read about how they begin to explain who these people were, I actually think it even gets worse, in my opinion. But I was still kind of keeping some of that in my head, so I thought maybe, but I even had like a bad memory of that. So I was thinking that maybe possibly there was an indigenous thing, and then I was like, oh. You're just going to basically say white people have screwed over other white people, and you're going to ignore literally, especially when you're dealing with like the West Coast, like of all, I mean, really all of the US, but we think about even like the documented and even admitted history, right? Like there's a way that they don't want to admit it, I think, in like the early like settlements, right? But like when you get into like the Andrew Jackson era, you do have like a lot of these liberals who want to admit, yeah, that was like maybe a little over aggressive, that kind of Western expansion that went into that kind of era. And like, so even some of the stuff that liberals would be even comfortable with admitting, they don't even do that.
You could blame it on the Spanish if you wanted
Right,
to, right? You could say like they did this for, like,
exactly.
yeah.
There's so many ways you could have went, and you just went like, oh, they just screwed other white people and they kind of disturbed the peace of, of resting people, right? Which, for me, I when I watched it, I was like, oh, that's interesting, and it's like an interesting thing, but like, I don't have too much more to say. It just begins to make the movie like severely fall flat for me, and I don't have much like energy into it because of that. Because there is a way that it still is settler guilt, but part of like guilt is actually not dealing with shit. When you have guilt, you have that kind of settlement guilt. You actually don't look at what it is, right? If you don't actually wrestle with it, and you see that kind of manifesting within the innards of this movie, and it's not a critique; it's literally the material, of the film. Because then, like, after that, is that when our whisperer comes in? Isn't it pretty
Yeah.
much like
So
right after?
yep, the next scene you get Tangina, who is who's by the way, best performance in the film. You know, hats off to her
100%.
for
And 100%. And like, even though the character annoys the shit out of me, Zelda Rubinstein, rest in peace. She was always very good at that kind of character, right? She always like was like good at that, and her she's even funny. I am jumping ahead. The part when Joe Beth Williams was like, I should go, and she's like, no, I gotta go in there and get her. And she goes, but you've never done this before. She goes, neither have you. She went, okay, go in, right? Like, that's just really well played. It's really good acting in that moment. But yeah, she comes in, and they're skeptical, especially you realize that Craig T. Nelson has kind of built a level of like cynicism towards the whole thing, right? He's like he's kind of like broke in his like kind of belief. It's not super clear if it's a belief that like they'll be able to get her out or whatever like that, but he's definitely going to a point of cynicism. So she
I
comes
think
in. Go ahead.
just to add, I think he was always more skeptical, right? So like the wife is definitely the one
Mm-hmm.
that why am I blanking on her name? Diane. She's
Diane.
definitely the one who like is quicker to believe
She's
in
a weed smoker.
yeah.
No, but I think it's part of it. He was reading Reagan, and she was she's the weed smoker. So maybe that is the comment: the liberal and the conservative living with each other.
Perhaps. But yeah, but go ahead. I mean, yeah, he is more skeptical. And I think
Yeah,
at this point he's gotten a little bit sick of like having all these people in his house doing all these experiments, etc. Yeah.
yeah, because he doesn't believe. Like, you get this sense that he doesn't believe that Tangina like is gonna bring the goods, right? So like the kind of what they do is establish that Tangina is the goods. And look, this is the thing with movies, and it becomes an 80s trope. You do it in earlier movies, but it's the Deus Ex Machina thing. Like, she can come in, she can solve all issues. All she got to do is just look, boom, 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 feel, touch, ask a few questions. Boom, I got it. I know what to do, right? And she confirms it because he was like, he makes a joke about like reading her mind. Can she hear? And then like she doesn't hear what he says, but then she does hear what he says, but she was concentrating. It becomes this joke, and so he immediately buys in. So she immediately has the plan, and this is the thing. I mean, I think there's a characteristic of 80s movies that has to deal with art. We have to reconcile with where we really get addicted to problems being solved in a jiffy, right? There is a metaphysical person with like abilities beyond our understanding who can solve all issues. And for me, like when I watch it, I just get really, really like I can't take it. It just doesn't work for me. And you get into the kind of final, thing, and she's talking about the light, and she gives the explanations. I find her explanations also interesting. I don't know if you have any of those lines. I actually have some of them here. Where did I put them? Oh, where did I have them?
I have a little bit of it.
Yeah,
But one of the things I did note too that's interesting about her character is like she makes Diane sort of go through this like pledge or this oath too, where she says, "Will you do anything I ask, even if it comes contrary to your beliefs as a human and as a Christian?" Right? And I think this is one of the kind of interesting things in the film is that like obviously there's a lot of, as you said, like Exorcist is very much a precursor of this film of like you've got to find this spiritual figure who will help resolve this issue with these demons or these spirits, right? But it's interesting that they make a move to make her really like anti-Christian or clear that her understanding of these things will sort of violate um you know orthodox, whatever that means, like
right,
typical Christianity that people would ascribe to.
right. Which is something you see, I think, also in Prince of Darkness. Though I think Prince of Darkness does it far more interestingly. And that's something you do. It actually is like the core of Prince of Darkness, that I think is far more interesting. But yeah, so because then when Tangina starts talking to her, she kind of gives her the kind of rundowns, right? Like there is no death. There is only transition to a different sphere of consciousness. Carol Ann is not like those she's with. She's a living presence in their spiritual earthbound plane. They are attracted to one thing about her that is different from themselves, her life force. It is very strong. It gives off its own illumination. It is a light that implies life and memory of love and home and earthly pleasure, something they desperately desire but can't have anymore. Right now, she's the closest thing to that. And that is a terrible distraction from the real light that has finally come for them. You understand me? Or
There's also,
go ahead.
do you have the terrible presence part?
Yes, that's literally what I was about to
No.
read. So I'm gonna skip one part. There is one more thing. A terrible presence is in there with her. So much rage, so much betrayal. I've never sensed anything like it. I don't know what hovers over this house, but it was strong enough to punch a hole into this world and take your daughter away from you. It keeps Carol Ann very close to it and away from the spectral light. It lies to her. It tells her things only a child can understand. It has been using her to restrain the others. To her, it simply is another child. To us, it is the beast. So for me, the creation of the beast is actually a really pernicious act that I think actually even fucks the narrative for me even more, because it essentially makes the characteristic, even though they might be justified to a certain degree, for the vengeance, or the kind of aggressive act towards the people in the house, it makes it malevolent. It makes it negative, right? The fact that their leader, he is this. Yes, he's enraged, but he's doing something that's so high level aggressive and mean and disgusting, and he's using a child to do it. And it's a thing that American movies do with certain types of vengeance. They do have righteous vengeance. Dirty Harry is able to do righteous vengeance. Travis Bickle, to a degree, is able to do righteous vengeance. Let's think about it. Rambo is able eventually to do righteous vengeance when he goes back to Vietnam, right? In part two, which will eventually hit, right? But um there's no way they couldn't write a script where it's just like, look, man, these people are actually all justified. They didn't like, why did you need a beast other than to sully them in some kind of way, right? And that's where I like then get completely off the road, because it's this idea that if you take vengeance, even in the spiritual plane, you have to be looked at as like going too far, right? You're going too far. And even the idea of vengeance also, I just think, like, why couldn't the ghosts want to take over to be materials? Like, now we want you to get out so we can live up in the house and just have our land back, right? We want you all to go and we're just going to live here. But it has to be something different in this kind of way. Yeah, Jay. I don't know if you have any
No,
thoughts. I'm
that
sure you do.
yeah, and then also, of course, the beast, right? This is a kind of synonym for the devil, right, as well, right? And I think that that's, the devil that's corrupting children, right, through your TV. um, and so there's these ways that it does. I mean, it's interesting in the way that you have Tangina come in and kind of do this little spiel and sort of reject, say that you might have to go against, or some of the orders I'm going to give you will contradict your Christian values here. But actually, in some ways, it's almost, it- I need to get this out, but I have this conversation with Darren, who's this minister, about the Old Testament. And in some ways, it's like it depends on what kind of Christianity we're talking about here too, because I think that there's a way in which, when you start dealing with the beast, and you, like, her version of Christian values may be her saying your liberal values, right, or something like that, like that, this, or your progressive thoughts, right? She says human too, right? So this humanity, kind of impulse, because what she's really kind of saying is that, like, in order to deal with a force this dark, like, you may have to transgress these normal boundaries of what you think is right and wrong. And one of the things she makes Steve do, right, is threaten to spank Carol Ann in order to get her attention. And he does this thing of like, oh, I would never, or I've never spanked our kids. That's ridiculous. And Diane's like, come on, you just have to go with it. Right. So there's this interesting thing of, Tangina knows what needs to be done. And again, this was the thing that I think one of the aspects that just bothers, right, is like that she just, like, all these other people have been trying to figure out, and she's the real, this is the real exorcist. Like, this is the person that really understands how these evil forces work and what you need to do. And again, like, it's such a strange movie, and I'm again gonna say it's not really horror, because it doesn't get you to a place where they really have to do anything that dark. Um, there's the discussion of sort of lying to Carol Ann and telling her to go towards the light, and then turning around and reversing it and saying go away from the light. This idea that Tangina knows how to separate her from the beast through manipulating the child, and that the parents have to be a part of this manipulation. So that's sort of, I guess, what they're driving at in terms of this transgression of, like, what you're supposed to do, that you're supposed to be honest um and kind of comforting and maybe pamper your children a little bit. Like, none of that. Like, we need to be disciplinarians in order to cut this cord, right? Which is actually quite a nefarious thing when you think about it, is like this sort of, like, if it's a commentary on parenting, the problem is that they're too lax, they smoke too much weed, and they accommodate the desires of their children, and they need to be, rougher and more demanding on them in order to keep them away from the evil, right? So, you get this, like, the kind of quirky, it's like kind of the industrial light and magic spectacle of the film, of, they talk about all the ways this was part of them. They do an 8-minute making of, and they spend like 3 of it talking about how smart they are for making the light look the way that it does coming out of the closet by using fish tanks and different colored lights and strobes and, like, all of this stuff, and how they made the light seem like a living force within the movie and all of this. And then they put they throw tennis balls through the light, right? And they go down to Ryan, who's able to catch them and confirm that my writing is on the tennis ball. And then they do the rope. And there's a scene you talked about where Tangina's arguing that she's going to go in to get Carol Ann. And, Diane convinces her, like, I should be the one to do it. And yeah, you already read that line, but it's funny. And Yeah, she's like, you're right, go ahead. And so she goes in, she gets her, and they separate. And I guess one of the nice things about the movie, if we could say that. Well, it's not really that sophisticated, but this could be the end of the film, and it is not the end of the film. And so Carol Ann is reunited with the family. They get her back. A really dumb, frustrating part of this to me is that they don't get the fuck out of the house immediately and never come back and have somebody bring their
And they
stuff
put
or whatever.
kids back in the bedroom, which I'm sorry. Now that I don't know a parent that would do that. Look, man, my daughter once had like a rodent in her, you know what I'm saying? Like in a room. Did we put her back in there for a week? No. You know what I'm saying? Like, no. Like, it's not happening. Like, it's just so that to me was so infuriatingly bad writing because there's ways they could have figured it out. To me, it would have been more suspenseful if they didn't go back to the room and they still got them. Right? Like, I get maybe like not getting out the house immediate. Maybe they underestimate it. I guess they're using the whole Tangina says this house is clean, which then means Tangina is not as good as, but like to put them back in the room, that get the entire hell out of here. And to like leave them alone and they're just the neglectful parents again. It's so stupid. But to me, it just reads like there was spectacle that they wanted to do that they weren't able to do yet to get, Jo Beth Williams like get felt up as she's like having her exorcist moment, on top of a wall by a ghost, right? To get more of really get the have the kind of fear of the clown actually actualize with the clown kind of getting Robbie, right? And then you get to have the Carol Ann thing and the big spectacle of them possibly both going in there. I also thought kind of right before that happens that I thought was an opportunity I didn't really love. I thought they could have made Craig T. Nelson's character a bit more complicated. The fact that he's just so like, well, you know what? Yeah, I'm quitting right now. And I was like, if he's supposed to be this successful businessman, like, I don't know, man. Like, is he gonna be that cut and dry? Like this investment in the American family being the centerpiece for great values, it didn't create human beings for me. It created really pernicious archetypes that they wanted that they wanted to sell to me, right? But to this point, and I mean, we can go through the sequence. So something that is factual is there's a sequence when they start, trying to get the kids in the room and they can't get through the door, and Jo Beth Williams goes through all of this this whole thing and a whole lot of stuff, a lot of big camera tricks, a lot of very famous shots. She ends up in the pool, right? And there's the part with like the skeletons. So there was years of rumors that these skeletons were real, and people were like, no, they're not real. They actually were. It is actually confirmed that they were actually real skeletons used from a medical school or a place that would supply a medical school, right? It's a big, long story. Look it up. Snipes or Snoops or all that has is Snoops, right? They have a whole thing where they can give you all the things on. You can look it up about why it was used and how it was used, but they were actually real skeletons, which to me is like absolutely no, like hell freaking no. What I read the thing kind of quickly. I'm not sure if the actors were aware of this though. That's one thing I don't know if they were made aware of it or not. I kind of hope not for themselves.
No wonder it's cursed. It's like these people, like this is why people had to die. Like
Right,
I'm with the people who believe that now.
You've now gone to the other side.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
I don't know about this last sequence or anything from the previous. I'm trying to think, was there anything else on the previous sequence that I missed? Yeah, I mean, I'm with you on all the stuff about the manipulation, the kind of ethics, and what it took to kind of get it done. It does feel like, yeah, the last thing I wanted to add is it does feel like whipping the neglectful parents into shape. And that's kind of what, even with Beatrice Straight's character, it's kind of like felt like these two parents who were kind of like too like modern and maybe slightly liberal needed to kind of get their old school education on how to be better parents to their children, right? You know, a little too much freedom. There's dangers on the other side. Get your shit straight, or you know, you might lose her to the wall.
She will speak to you from inside the TV. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, other things, I guess, Diane's hair has turned, she gets like streaks, like the Reed Richards streaks, white hair streaks, from, I guess, because of her time on the other side. Um, and this, of course, is a plot device for her to be dyeing the white out of her hair as their kids are back in their bedroom. And yeah, I mean, I just have to reiterate what you said. I mean, the idea was, first of all, I can tell you with certainty that the minute that I was reunited with my kid, that my wife would be like, "Okay, we're leaving," and she probably would say, "We're gonna burn the whole place down." But, that we would get to a hotel that night without question, right? And again, like, I don't believe that, you know, poltergeist and this type of thing happens. But it wouldn't have to be that significant. It could be a really bad, roach infestation or something like that, and that would happen in our house. So, I think that it's fascinating that they think that lands as a movie narrative, and I don't know what that is, but then they're like, okay, we're gonna move. So I guess to their credit, they like do decide that they are gonna move immediately, and the way they use it is Steve has to go back to work to basically tell his boss, he says he doesn't take go to hell for an answer, so I'm going to send him directions, like I'm going to give him directions, right? So he's going to settle things and kind of finish up, and says he might be home late, right? Because he's sort of wrapping up his work, I guess, and, trying to close up loose ends and that kind of thing. Still, it doesn't make much sense. Like, you would get the family out of the house. Like, where they go is just a Holiday Inn that's a little bit up the street. Like, you could stay there and still go to work that day and do that. But it leaves this space for the kids to be back in the room that night, for Diane to decide to dye her hair back, even though she said, joked with her daughter that it looked punk. Um, and, then you get the creepy clown. And at this point, the clown actually attacks Robbie, right? So up until this point, the clown has not really, like, it's been something that's creepy looking and scares Robbie, but it hasn't played into, really, as far as I remember, the kind of the actual, terrorizing, I guess you could say, of the kids. But it like literally chokes him and tries to drag him under the bed, which again is a big, I wonder the origins of the monster under the bed. I know that it goes back further than this, but it was big in the 80s. Like, I remember my father, when we put me to bed at night, would do the little joke thing of like, I'll check under the bed, like, and check in the closet, like those sort of things. um
They even made that Fred
so
Savage movie about the whole underworld of
right.
monsters under the bed.
We Which we have to do. That is that 90s or is that 80s? Little Monsters?
I think it might be a little early 90s. I don't know.
It might be
Someone
early 90s.
in the chat can check for us. I'm not quite
Yeah.
sure.
I do wanna do that movie at some point. It's a fun movie. But, might not be till we get to the 90s. But yeah, so you have that, and then there's just, you know, the closet comes alive again, becomes a portal, it's like sucking the children in, like Diane's trying to save them. There's the whole scene where the hallway extends, so she's like trying to get to them, and the door is getting further and further away, but she eventually gets to them. And there's all this stuff, and then yeah, you get the scene that you were just talking about, where suddenly, as Steve gets home in particular, well, no, it goes before that, because she runs outside. This part also really bothered me, just like narratively. I'm like, what is going on? Like, why don't you pick up the phone and call your neighbors, or
It's
whatever,
just
or
spectacle. It's like this
call the
spectacle.
freaking, yeah. And she runs outside and starts yelling over the fence to the neighbors, Tuttlemans or whatever their name is, and she stupidly, like, I don't even know, the physics don't even explain to me how this happens, but she, like, manages to fall into the pool, that which is not yet really a pool because they haven't actually put the pool foundation, like the actual apparatus of the pool in, but it's completely dug out to be the pool. And so she falls down in there, and this is the first encounter with a skeleton. And then there's a bunch more, and you start to get actual caskets coming up and like popping open, and these skeletons coming out. The skeletons, I don't think at any point become really animated, right? Like they're not actually embodied by spirits themselves,
No, it's like
although they're
it's more like the caskets rushing out, or they kind of like rise up and like they kind of like just like move because they're skeletons and they don't have any cartilage and they can't move themselves, but they're basically just kind of rushing out, via the caskets. It's like a big spectacle kind of creation. It's not really that specific. I mean, it is that kind of Hollywood thing of, you want to have the big flourish at the end, so you basically throw everything at the fucking wall: skeletons, caskets, lights, flying things. Let's just get it all in there. And really, we're supposed to think about it as like the beast, is doing his final hurrah to get him.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, the Tut Hills, that's the name of the family. They show up to help pull her out of the pool, but they won't go into the house to help her with her kids, which is also like, I guess, kind of funny. Like it's just sort of like, I mean, in some sense, it fits a little bit with the Tut Hills characters in the film, that they like kind of are always just like about their own shit, which maybe you could say is kind of a little bit of a commentary about suburban life and how people are not actually like real neighbors to each other, and they don't actually have good relationships. They kind of just, it's like, oh, like I'll help you out of the pool because like what the fuck, you're screaming, but your kids are in trouble in your house. Like I'm not going in there. Like we're going back home. Um, so there's that, and then Steve pulls up along with his boss, Teague, which is interesting. I mean, I don't know whether they're supposed to have reconciled, or maybe they're not going to move, because I know Teague is always kind of trying. He tried to give them the bigger house and all of this stuff, and obviously has a lot of money that he can kind of throw at Steve, but this obviously presents the opportunity within the film for the line of Steve confronting Teague as he gets home and sees these skeletons everywhere, of, son of a bitch, you moved the cemetery, but you left the bodies, didn't you? Son of a bitch, you left the bodies and you only moved the headstones. You only moved the headstones. And then he screams, why? In this really like shrill, weird face or voice. Um, and yeah, I mean, eventually, they get out of there. He finally gets up and helps, you know, the mom, who's been like, she's sort of, there's the image of her holding on to Robbie while Robbie's holding on to Carol Ann. Again, I don't actually buy the physics of this, because if there was like a powerful force sucking everything into the closet, there's no way that Robbie's able to hold on to Carol Ann's little hand and stop her from getting sucked in. But whatever, they get saved and they get out. And Dana, of course, is just dropped off by a friend right at this moment as the house is collapsing, and monsters are kind of running after them or whatever. And they peel off, and the whole neighborhood seems like it's finally starting to see like some kind of, which is also a weird thing about the film. Like, why just their house? Like,
Yeah, was like the grave site only at their house? That was also my question as well.
I didn't know if it was because they were digging a pool, right? Which is like disturbing maybe these skeletons more, but you would think that they wouldn't be the only suburban family that's dug a pool in this graveyard. So it's strange that way, but their house, basically implodes under the forces as they drive away. And the last bit you get is them going to the Holiday Inn, and Steve pulling the TV out of the room and leaving it outside of the room, which again, you could try to draw something into it, but it's really just a device. It's really just, um, kind of funny, and also just that the TV has been a source of trauma for them. I mean, they've literally had it on this entire time too, because I think they were afraid to turn it off because they could talk to Carol Ann through it potentially, could communicate potentially, so they didn't ever want to shut it off because they probably also didn't know what that meant, right? And so you get that, and that's the end of the movie. I mean, I don't, you know.
No, yeah. By the end of the movie, I was pretty done. I was like, yeah, the 80s and Hollywood and their obsessions with creating these kinds of stories around metaphysics to kind of like have like a wet noodle critique of how we're living now. It just reminded me of all the bad conversations that I was told when I was a kid about, why things are bad in the world. Like I immediately got rushed back to that, and now, I think something of doing of this series in general has helped me realize is like why so much of the bad discourse exists and some of the bad kind of I just think frameworks of looking at existence, happens in our society here in the US, because when you're kind of forced to sit with these kinds of thoughts in this way of like logic and reasoning, there's no way you could like come up with any intelligent, inquisitive, analytical answers towards anything. It just leads you to kind of, I gotta go find me a Tangina, literally and figuratively, right? I gotta go find me a Tangina, and she'll figure it out for me, and we'll just figure it out. Then all will be okay, And but yeah, but also that last sequence is just terrible. Like I like no, I mean I get the dumb white people thing, but like no, you know what I'm saying? They didn't do it for dumb white people reasons. They don't think white people are just that dumb. They just are just that's bad filmmaking.
Yeah, and again, I mean, it's not like when you watch the descriptions. I mean, people have said this in the chat, but it's true. But normal is this sort of dog whistle. Like I mean, it's to say white people are normal and everybody else is abnormal, right? It's to set this white supremacist, frame around normativity within America, and so there is no there is no real critique. Like all of these things, I mean, there's so much space there for a settler colonial critique. There's so much space there for a critique of capitalism. Capitalism is the thing that may be most close to what it's critiquing, I think, because I think that there is something about the fact that this developer is so sort of depraved in his drive for profit that he kind of intentionally seeks out cemeteries as places to continually move because the land is cheap, um in order to like make the biggest profit. And he's such a corner cutter, right, that he doesn't even bother to move the bodies. He just moves the headstones, right? So there is a way that you can, I think, read it, but I agree it's not the way that they're intending. It's kind of like maybe the unfettered capitalism. This is like the critique of neoliberal of Reaganomics, of that kind of idea that you get within liberals at the time, which does exist, and it creates some interesting tension within 80s movies that we don't see as much in the 90s and later, when the adoption of neoliberalism is totally a two-party thing, when Democrats and liberals have basically abandoned a notion of a liberalism that is not neoliberal, right? They've accepted privatization and unfettered capitalism, and don't even try to make the arguments that we should, raise taxes, invest more in public resources and infrastructure and the social wage, those kind of things that you might get from earlier forms of liberalism. So there's some of that critique within the film, I think. But it is also, as you say, like, really you need the tangina. You need the person who will help you learn how to parent your kids in a more um, hands-on fashion, to not be, led astray by. I mean, actually, it's quite Reagan. There's a lot of Reagan family values shit within this film, and it's not criticizing it. It's actually promoting it. It's really, I think,
Yeah, I mean, I'll say like two last things because I always say, when people try to say, "Oh, well, movies like this really indict capitalism," and I always say, well, then why doesn't when the mass audiences who watch these movies, um, the best critique that they can have is that unethical business is the issue, not capitalism as a system, right? And I think that to me always ends up hitting people. They'll say like literacy and all those types of things, and I'm like, no, I don't think so, because a movie that really goes hard at capitalism, they'd be able to understand it. I don't think it's literacy. It's the film doesn't want to do that. One last kind of technical thing, because you were speaking about like all the use of light and how impressed they were. And it's funny, man. Like I thought about Tarkovsky's Stalker, right? And how when they go into the zone, you never actually see the zone, but I feel the zone. Right. I go there and I'm like, the whole time I'm like, ooh, man, like the zone, bro. And like the zone's fucking with me, right? And I'm like, what is the zone? Like the zone. And this, I'm like, the other side is lights, right? Lots of lights and a big ass face coming out. And Carol Ann. And I'm like, this is the issue with Hollywood filmmaking. They don't unlock imagination. They flood you with spectacle because they think you're stupid and they want to imprint, a certain idea that's not very developed on your brain.
yeah. And when you get like so there's like the period where you get like kind of the fleshy version of the portal, right? Like, I think it towards the end. Again, it looks like something straight out of Star Wars. Like it's which of course makes sense because it is George Lucas and all of that. But like, yeah, and that's also why to me it also has like more of a sci-fi suburban, like I obviously I can't deny that there are ghosts in the film and that it's dealing with sort of spirituality and the terrorizing of children in a family. Um but and I'll say more about this. I want to evolve my thoughts because people are like, in the chat, now we get the real Jared. There must be death and gore in a horror film. Uh, I mean, I think that there are ways that you can build, terror and horror and suspense that don't have to be gory. Um, Death is an interesting question for me because I think that, I mean, death is obviously one of the deepest sort of philosophical questions for humanity, right? It's something that always kind of has to be, um, you know, it's any form of philosophy is trying to determine like what does death mean, right? And thinking about life in relation to death. Um, and I think what's interesting in this film is that death doesn't ever really enter into the equation at all, right? So even if somebody wasn't killed, I mean, there is the belief that they might not get Carol Ann back, but it's more along the lines of kind of a supernatural abduction, right? Like it's more stands in for stuff like kidnapping to me, than it actually stands in for, you know, the notion that Carol Ann might die. There is a sort of idea that she might cross into the light, right? Which would mean that she, goes to like the heaven or whatever that they have in the film, and they spend time talking about what the light is. Um, but I don't know. I mean, I'll think about that more. I think that for me, a fear of death is associated at least with what horror is.
Yeah, I don't think you need gore. I think gore is a particular kind of horror film. I think wrestling with death and death as a because if you think of even the classic horror films like Eyes Without a Face, right? What's the whole crux of that? They keep killing people to give the woman her face that she can fix. And I feel like it's in I can't think of a horror film that doesn't a real horror film that doesn't deal with it. Now, in a gory kind of heavy-handed way, no, I don't think you necessarily need that, right? Um, but I think wrestling with death in a real way that becomes tangible and actualized, maybe through characters, side characters, or a lead character, or a character kind of becoming an undead person in some kind of way, right? I actually think it's necessary personally.
Well, we'll dig in. We got a few others, so I'll read some more comments in the chat.
Cool.
But I think we're gonna do Evil Dead 2 next Monday. We have to clarify whether we're doing it, patron only, or like
Hmm.
and Cena's agreed to do it with us, which I can't wait to get Cena rant on Evil Dead
Yeah.
2. But then other than that, the confirmed ones that we have this month is a week from Friday. We're going to have Dylan Rodriguez on for the John Carpenter film Prince of Darkness, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And then on Halloween, Nick Estes is going to join us, and we're going to do the Blob, which the 80s version of the Blob is actually a remake of the 1950s version of the
50s,
Blob,
yeah.
which I actually saw, I think, first, because my father, thought it was funny to show me and I actually saw that one quite young. Um, but yeah. So anyway, I look forward to both of those. Those will be fun.
Same.
All right, so
Any other comments?
Poltergeist, aka the Indigenous Get Back. This was early on. This would have been the good version of the
We
film, I think.
wish.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, 80s horror so bad. I need y'all to find good black horrors like Ganja and Hess. Is that 80s?
No, God in the Hess is the 70s by Bill
Yeah.
Gunn.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a longer conversation about black horror films. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole now. But yeah, interesting thoughts. And though I do say it's a movie made in the 90s was Death by Temptation. If people haven't seen that, it was with Kadeem Hardison. And I rewatched it not too long ago, and I actually quite liked it. I thought it was pretty damn good.
Has Big Trouble in Little China come up? That might be 90s. It is 80s. We
It
are
is
gonna have to
80s.
do
We're
it.
gonna have to do it. That's one of my like John Carpenter like, John, bro. We have to have a conversation, but we do have to do it. It's an 80s staple.
Yeah. We'll be doing a bunch of John Carpenter stuff just because his movies are more interesting than, most. Big Trouble in Little China aside, I would say. But most of his movies are more interesting than a lot of what we've done. And actually, we're doing Prince of Darkness, but we could have easily just done John Carpenter movies this month, and we chose not to because a lot of them are good enough that we can do them, not during a kind of horror themed month, I felt. Um, there's something unbearably articulate in how the film locates terror not in devils, but in distance between mother and daughter, between the banquet of reason and the strange pulse of the invisible. Yeah, I think that's well said. Um, the the mother and daughter aspect and the kind of like the parental aspect, I think, is quite nefarious. Um, so they said they're going to challenge you on dislike for this film and linking it to Velvet by David Lynch. I'd argue it's two sides of the same coin. I don't know if you have thoughts.
I'm not the hugest Blue Velvet. I like Lost. I'm a big Lost Highway and Mulholland Drive fan. I find Blue Velvet to be okay. I'm not the
Yeah.
hugest, but I'll say this. All I'm going to say is this: on his worst day, Lynch is a better filmmaker than Spielberg, standing over for Tobe Hooper Hooper, and also a better filmmaker than Hooper on his best day too. Like I just think Lynch is a better filmmaker. Like the actual cinema has a better life to it. But that's it.
Yeah. And I'm sure we'll do Blue Velvet at some point too, because it's definitely an 80s film that we have to do, I think. Uh, Spielberg is 80s version of a 50s era idealistic portrayal. I think absolutely it is a kind of revival of um, the kinds of cultural production that you got in the 50s with a 80s vibe. Very
And I'm
much.
gonna say, not in the way that you would say it. He would admit that. He would admit that like vibe he felt was core to movies. He wouldn't call it idealistic. He would probably call it a different word, but he would agree with you.
Yeah, and he's a product of that. I mean, he's a boomer, right? So like he's definitely a product of that 1950s era of television and movies and stuff like that. So that would have also, I think he yeah, he's very much a product of that. Um all right. This is when Reagan died, just in case anybody didn't know. It was 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Jared Ball's wedding. We had already said our vows, and I think we were cutting the cake when news spread, raised the glass. It was beautiful. Um, let's see. Spielberg is the smallest minded of directors of epics because he seems to be most aggressively American in his mundanity. Even War of the Worlds became a father son drama. Yeah.
Yo, it's that War of the Worlds. I remember when I went and saw it, and I was just so annoyed. I was like, so this is really about becoming unified with your family. So like you're gonna like distill a global issue, not no, a universal issue into a story about father, son, and daughter, right? And him finally being a good dad. That's bullshit.
Yeah. So Jared Ball also brought up, watched a discussion of the history of ghosts in Western literature. They were given a negative connotation, apparently because the claims contested various church beliefs. I mean, this is a whole thing. I mean, and I think that this movie is kind of interesting in that regard. I actually tried to search it a while ago about whether, you know, Christians protested this film. It didn't say there was any kind of protests, but opposition was primarily voiced through religious publications and conservative media rather than through public demonstrations. And they did talk about it as contradicting Christian beliefs, which I mean, it basically says it's doing, right? That's kind of Tangina's whole point there, which, you know, in the 80s, this was a big thing too. I mean, it still is to some extent. You still get some of this, but I feel like nowadays it's much more wrapped in this kind of culture wars, like broad stuff of like, the rights critiques of DEI and diversification and sometimes stuff like I saw Zach Bryant, who's a country musician who's also a veteran and stuff like that. Fairly like pro America type dude, but he released a snippet of a song where he's like talking negatively about police and about ICE. And this caused like this huge uproar recently among conservative media and people calling him un-American and that he's disgracing the brave heroic ICE officers and all of this shit. And it was just like it was funny. So like you still have that, obviously the culture war engine, is huge on the right. But in the 80s there was a lot of, and it kind of wasn't just solely on the right, I would say, that Christian institutions did have this kind of panic around, moral panic, I guess you could call it, right, around the the occult. Like, I mean, just there was a weird vibe around a lot of it. I feel like there was, and we've talked about this a little bit before, but like families who wouldn't let their kids do Halloween, was that, I mean, that still exists, but it was a bigger thing in the 80s. Also questions about whether you should watch or play with certain things or certain types of toys or comic books or, video games, there were these concerns about kind of that they were teaching these unchristian or like bad moral values and things like that within them, that I feel like that war has largely been lost by those particular cultural warriors, to the extent where they don't fight it as much as they used to. I mean, these are also the same. I'm thinking of some folks who, when I was a kid, wouldn't let their kids attend science classes, right? Because they were teaching evolution as opposed to, the biblical explanation of where do babies come from or whatever. And so, yeah, anyway, all of that was 80s. Um, Listen, Pizza Hut was amazing. And as we have to say, I appreciate the people who showed up. Slow down for the serious topic. The most serious part of the film. Pizza Hut was that girl. Um, uh, Pizza Hut with the arcade in the back, pictures of soda, big screen TV. It was crazy. What a time to be alive. Um, Pizza Hut buffet, absolutely. Um, yep, smoke weed and go to the hut was the move. And Jared also made sure that you got a little line there, M2 for you New York snobs.
I take it, bruh. I will take it.
Chuck E. Cheese was everything as a child.
Yeah, okay. That I experienced, though.
We can joke about a lot of things, but not 80s Pizza Hut. Tavern Pizza on the south side of Chicago kills the Hut pies every time. I will say this. There were a lot of Golden Spike was one where I was, Angelo's. Like, there were other places that had the same, like, and maybe in some cases even superior in terms of, like, some of the Pizza Hut thing was definitely that we were kids and we were marketed it, and it was like right along in between the McDonald's commercials and, Wendy's or whatever else. So that was part of it. But pizza parlors in general, and pizza, going out for pizza being like a family experience that involved entertainment, dad getting a pitcher of beer, the kids playing video games, like it it was absolutely a vibe. All right. Um Other things. A friend who had his parents get a priest to perform an exorcism. They said later turned out that they had schizophrenia, which is like, awful that families would do such a thing. But yeah, this is like, I mean, and this film certainly doesn't help with that, right? Because like, there's never a question in the film of, is there, there's a slight moment. The mom, while she's smoking weed, is reading Carl Jung in her bed, which is also a very 80s, early 90s thing to do, is have the white parent. My mother also read Carl Jung for a while. So yeah, but it doesn't last. It's because, I mean, partly because the daughter's abducted by aliens or whatever, ghosts. Um, Capitalism is literally ghoulish. I mean, that's the thing. That's the frustrating part, is that like the movie has all of the elements that would be there for a really cool film, and it just fails. The bay window next to the jacuzzi, one of the great middle class signifiers. Yeah, these were big. This was very 80s. That part too. Getting a pool, having a jacuzzi, having a bay window. Like, these are the aspirations of, you know 80s suburbia. All right. Is there much else? I did forget to say this. Yeah, Dana gets out and has the big "What's happening?" um Yeah, so Justin Potter's latest sit rep with John Elmer. I haven't seen it yet. I'm sure it's great. The discussion of the occupation theft of Palestinian bodies from Gaza cemeteries. I mean, this is also why films like this, I think, don't hit as well nowadays as they used to, because we've all seen real horror unfold so much over the last couple of years. John Carpenter, so The Fog, The Thing, we will do both of those for sure. We will also do Escape from New York for sure.
And I'll say The Fog does the better. There's a similar thing to The Fog and Poltergeist of the idea that there are people who did not get their earning and they get revenge for it. I prefer The Fog. I forgot about that one. There is a kind of Poltergeist similarity to that, and The Fog is definitely the preferred method of doing this kind of film.
Strange how children who were raised in the 80s are obsessed with spending money at establishments as real fun. So I would say, I mean, obviously I'm contradicting myself because I just spent, 20 minutes talking about how amazing Pizza Hut was. But I would say to some extent, but much less than nowadays, I think that now it is very difficult for a lot of people to even imagine going outside of their houses and not spending money. Um, to the extent that I think a lot of people just stay home now, even because they realize like I'm too poor to go outside is sort of is something I've heard people say, even from like younger, like folks 18 to 24 say that kind of thing. Like I don't have the money to go outside, you know. And I mean, obviously there's some reality to that for sure about how everything has kind of, been pushed to this level where you have to spend money to go outside. But one, I would say in the 80s, it was a lot cheaper to be able to do it, even in terms of like real wages. But also, there were, I felt like a lot more ways that me and my friends would go out and have fun that had nothing to do at all with spending money, you know? So I don't know, like Stranger Things style fun, get on our bikes and go, you know, go out. All right. I think that's pretty much we have not done Serpent and the Rainbow yet. I
It's
think we
been
will do it.
years since we have.
Yeah.
I think we have to. It's been years since I've seen that movie, though. It's been a long time.
Yeah. And it also deals with like what we talked about with Predator, like the Predator 2,
Mm-hmm.
this idea of like um, Haitian voodoo evil
Yeah.
and this
No,
kind of
I
stuff.
remember that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right, so there was a question here, and I'm going to try to parse through it, make sure I understand it. Can you speak to to maybe how our overlords, in quotes, say narrative about what they want for their own families versus what our overlords want for the little people? Do these overlap completely or at all? Does the producer director have an instructional plan for their storytelling, or do they have a belief that they are a part of us? Do they fail to fake an alignment with us, or are they guiding us to BS? So that's a good question. Do you have any initial thoughts? I could say something,
I
but
mean, to the second one,
it's kind of related because I asked them to
yeah.
explain a little bit more what they meant in the first one, and
Oh,
that's when
okay.
yeah, yeah.
I mean, how I would say it is, I think in some ways it depends on the director between I think like two options you gave. Like the last one, like they're like purposely guiding us to BS. I mean, I think they are looking to purposely guide us somewhere often. Whether they think it is bullshit, no. Like I do truly believe Spielberg is a true believer in the things that he promotes. From him to Christopher Nolan, I mean, these people are like ideologues. Like they truly believe this kind of stuff. Now whether they believe everyone is like everyone else, I think kinda yes, but also I think the other caveat to add to it is I don't think they think about certain types of people at all because they never have to deal with them, right? Unless they're doing a movie that's like, oh, I went and did this movie, and I never thought about the people who live like this. But then it's always a way that they reduce it to what they're used to, right? So I do think that they think that they're being universalist, but it's the same issue with liberalism. What is liberalism's universal ideal? It's white Western man, right? That is the way that they think. So when they think that they find the kind of most, perfect liberal enlightenment figure, that is a universality. And they have a hard time on multiple levels when you challenge that is not a universal figure. That is actually a very singular figure that also has like really, really nefarious edges and histories and points to it. That's my first response to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously there's this long history of the ruling class developing, or having, I mean, this is gets back to like kind of Cedric Robinson's work around racial regimes and like how these things actually function. And there is the kind of like, so the role of people like directors and writers um, is not necessarily that they are the ruling class, right? Especially early on. I mean, at this point, I would say Steven Spielberg is part of the ruling class firmly, and George Lucas too, because they have accumulated so much wealth at this point and they own means of production. Um, but I think that, earlier on in their lives, like they're not necessarily there yet. But it's a kind of there's an aspiration for them, right, to become that. And so to fit into bourgeois, like they aspire to bourgeois, right, which means they also aspire ideologically to bourgeois, which like is can take different forms, right? You can have bourgeois people that are critical of the Trump administration or the Reagan administration, right? But it doesn't mean that they're not, still ruling class and have the kind of ideology of the ruling class within our system. But I think that what happens is that these processes of like filmmaking over periods of time, that the people who rise and who become very successful, it's because of this overlap into like ruling class dominant ideology to extent where they're like very useful to capitalism essentially and to imperialism. um so like in terms of what they're trying to get across, I mean, yeah, there's a long history of capitalists doing and paying for kind of morality, you know i- i- worker ethics, right? Like the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant idea, the ethic of like we're going to be a super hard working white person who goes to work every day, who's always there on time, maybe works extra, like just get ahead. And people are told this stuff all the time, hey, in the early years of your career, just work extra hard and prove yourself, right? And then you will get privileges from that and promoted, etc., right? um so I do think that they believe that stuff, and so they try to kind of instill certain values around that. And part of that, there is obviously all of these bourgeois politics around the nuclear family and how that's supposed to operate and function, which is deeply connected to capitalism. And so this film for me fits in there somewhere. And again, it doesn't have to be that they're like it gets to the question of why, which like it's hard to ever know exactly why. And perhaps a better way of looking at it is it's useful, right? So it's not so much that the bourgeoisie probably doesn't care why, but they're just like, hey, look, like this is, it's promoting family values. We can talk about it and spin it in all these kind of ways. We can promote it this way. And that's also, I think, and maybe you say something about this too. I mean, this is where the studio side of things, I think, comes in around cultural production very much, of like, we're going to do these little things, these little tweaks to the script. We're going to, promote these films in this way, but the choices around promotion are also connected to, what does the studio want to see or promote or intervene in terms of American life in certain ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where, like, I think people sometimes, when you think about base and superstructure, like, you think about, like, means of production and relations of production and how those things, and then how the superstructure is, ideology and all these things that are put out. Like, they need a certain ideology in order to kind of basically make people either accept the way the base goes and so forth and so on. And I think in the 80s, I think the family thing became really important because the 70s was so disastrous for the bourgeoisie and also the middle class. Because think about how many, especially middle class white kids, think about how many middle class white people fought with their children over Vietnam, over Black Power, right? White kids saying like "fuck you, mom and dad" for like not opposing white supremacy, and like not talking to their kids, and like they're scarred by it, right? And like there's like all these scars, and that was a big thing about Reagan, was this kind of rectifying and bringing back. The 70s was chaos. Carter was powerless to do anything. He was too wimpy. I'm going to come back. We're going to make America great again, right? We're going to go back to those values, right? But I think there was also a productive forces element to that, where because with strong families, you get strong workplaces. We've let shit go a little too wild. We need to kind of instill these strong families. We need to be responsible, so forth and so on. So when it gets to the studios, yeah, these studio heads, you don't become a studio head just because they think you are smart. You have to have ideas, and you have to have ideas within a center of capital, and that you're going to basically be able to maintain capital, and that you're going to give messages that the people who have the business interests with you, whether it's, fossil fuels or government, are going to want to work with you, because they do work with other agencies. They have to, like capital, they all communicate with each other, and they all need each other at various moments, right? For various things, and quite often. So they need someone who does it. I mean, just look at people like Michael Eisner, from Michael Eisner to Walt Disney to even like big executives like Harvey Weinstein. Look, Weinstein, yes, he produced all those movies, but what also was one of his big things? He was a huge Democratic Party donor and fundraiser. He ran Democratic Party fundraisers. I mean, that's why Hillary, Oprah, all these people were super spooked when the information they all already knew came out about him being a criminal, right? Because he literally helped them get money in politics, right? So they all work within that scope. It's like one big family of capital, and the right ideas, the right moments, what they want, what agendas, they're in these conversations. I mean, and we talked about it with the Cedric Robinson. Like, Woodrow Wilson invited D.W. Griffith to the White House to show Birth of a Nation, like, to celebrate it. So it's all part of it.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. I appreciate, you know, those comments. I don't I don't think I have anything else other than a couple people brought this up that Spielberg is a bit Zionisty too, right? Which definitely, and we will probably more than a bit, but we'll I think deal with that most directly probably when we get to uh, the Last Crusade, because I think that film is very Zionist, Christian Zionist. Even I mean Raiders was too, and we talked about that a little bit, but it gets even a little bit more direct, I think, with the Last Crusade. But yeah, it's there for sure. I In this particular film, I just don't think it's as much it didn't resonate as much in terms of me the issues I had with this film of like saying like, oh, that's because he's Zionist here. But yeah, I mean there is the whole that one moment of it's not an ancient tribal burial ground. I mean, is a funny moment, right? Because he also is recognizing in that moment that actually would be bad. Like you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to disrupt the ancient tribal burial ground, which in a lot of ways is like kind of the inverse of what reality is, because much more often I think what happens is the disruption of the tribal burial ground, or as you talked about, like the slave burial grounds and things like this, that these are most often the ones that are not properly preserved and and get sold as real estate, you know. But yeah, I mean, obviously, it's more of a commentary, I think, on you're not even looking after your own white ancestors, the settlers that preceded you. Yeah.
Your legacy. That's funny. That's actually really funny in a really sick way. But
Yeah. All right, folks. So we'll see you next week. Yeah. Thanks again.
for sure. Peace.